unite and work together if we're all going to get through this.
Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care.
All right, welcome to the 5th episode of the Sensible Socialist podcast. This week we'll be talking about something that's not often considered by the wider public, but it's an incredibly important topic, which is the history of American communism. To discuss this history, I have with me a special guest. His name is Josh Morris. Josh is a historian at Wayne State University, and his area of focus is actually American communism, particularly the history of the Communist Party of the United States of America. Josh is a member-turned historian of the CPUSA and is a faculty member at Wayne State. This summer, Josh is actually teaching a course about the value of working in an actual real live archive for doing research as opposed to just doing it on the internet. So that class is actually free to the public, and it's going to be at the Walter Reuther Library in Detroit. So with that, I want to, we'll take it away, and just want to let you know this is a very long conversation, goes through a lot of different things, basically starting at the beginning of American communism and going right up until the present. And so it totals about 3 hours, so it's quite a long haul, but if you have any interest in the history of American communism, this discussion will be incredibly important for you to understand the course and some of the interesting events that have led us to where we are. So with that, let's take it, and you can hear the conversation I had with Josh Morris. Okay, so Josh, it is really awesome to actually talk to you, because I don't think we've ever actually even spoken using our voices to one another.
Yeah, I don't think not using our voices, no.
I did watch something that I think you were giving a lecture on something about the CPUSA, and I did watch it, so I've heard your voice, but I have not actually had the pleasure of talking to you, and I don't even remember exactly how it happened, but somehow we became Facebook friends. I don't really exactly remember how it sort of happened, but we must have agreed on something on some forum or some mutual friend or something like that. It doesn't really
Crossing
matter.
of paths,
Yeah.
that usual thing.
Exactly. And, I'm somewhat down on social media in general, because I think it has a lot of relatively destructive effects, but it obviously has a lot of good things too, like being able to meet other people who aren't necessarily around you, but shared similar ideas. And when I think, the one impression I get, at least from you, is that you're also somebody who can deal with disagreement or misunderstanding or something like that without losing your mind in some ways, or just without being able to actually kind of have conversations about things that a lot of people either are not very well informed on or have some pretty weird views. And so that being said, I mean, it is a pleasure to talk to you, and I feel like I have a certain amount of knowledge about the history of American socialism and socialist ideas, but you have a certain expertise in some ways, definitely more than I do. And so to me, it's just it'll be very interesting to get much more of your kind of learned perspective on some of the things that I feel like I have a very surface level understanding about. So start off, if you could, by just giving us a bit of an introduction about you, who you are. One thing that I think is really interesting for most people is actually how you got involved in the sort of Marxism, socialism, communism thing, and then kind of where that's led and what you're doing currently.
Okay. Well, my name is Joshua Morris, as is probably implied by the title of whatever the podcast is. I've been working with Wayne State University for the past 3 years in the history department there. I'm currently doing some work at the Walter Reuther P. Archive, where we're teaching a course over the summer on kind of a little bit of what you were saying earlier, the degenerative nature of social media. We're trying to explain to the public for free ways that they can utilize the archive and get better analysis of history than they can by doing research on the internet. And so we're trying to find ways to make the archive more open to people, more accessible, use things like hashtags to make it easier for people to go through finding aids and whatnot. So that's what I'm doing now. As far as how I got involved in the history of American communism, I'd have to say that it began back in 2008 when I was asked to conduct an oral history project for the University of California at Santa Barbara. That's where I got my undergraduate degree. The history department there wanted the journals and letters that were kept over the years by a woman named Vera Feldman. And I didn't know who this woman was at the time, but when I go over there to meet with her and I'm looking over all these documents, I realize this is the oldest living descendant of a man named Joseph Dietzken, a writer and a philosophy of history. Are you familiar with Dietzken at all?
No, I'm not.
Well, Dietzken kept in close contact with Marx personally, and I didn't know this at the time, but he's apparently credited with coining the phrase dialectical materialism in order to describe Marx's method.
Interesting.
Marx called it historical materialism, and I guess Dietzken was kind of a penchant for terminology, and he said you should use the phrase dialectical.
Yeah.
Well, after finding that out, I just became more and more interested in, what this philosophy was, how it attempted, to unpack an explanation for the world around us, and most importantly, how Joseph Dietzken's son moved to the United States and created a drafting company that is still in existence, the Eugene Dietzken Drafting Corporation. All of this was just so fascinating to me, the link between communism, Marxism, and the United States. It kind of, I don't know what the right word is, but it just confused me. I was, intrigued as to how there was this link with the United States that I've never heard before. And up to that point, I had taken dozens of U.S. history courses and had never heard about this at all. So, admittedly, at this time, I was already exposed to the ideology of communism, workers' control over production, however, but I wasn't fully convinced by it, nor did I fully believe in the sort of high-flying concepts that are in the Communist Manifesto. I kind of thought of the manifesto as more of an attempt to instigate people into action as opposed to any kind of serious philosophical document. After my work at UCSB, I went on to CSU Pomona for my master's in history, and there I wrote on the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, a huge jumble of words for a union, also known as the UCAPOA, as an example of how American communists acted independently during the Popular Front. By independently, what I mean is they didn't necessarily take their orders and directives from the Communist International and the Soviet Union. From there on, I just kind of set out to unearth how far individual communists acted independently. How much did they do this? So in 2011, I started the CPUSA Oral History Project, and to date, I have 13 oral histories collected from some of the most prominent party members over their history, including Beatrice Lumpkin. She's currently the oldest living CPUSA member. The late Armando Ramirez, who unfortunately died about 6 months ago, but he was a key Mexican-American organizer in Chicago. And Michelle Winter, the daughter of Carl and Helen Winter, two individuals who were charged in the Smith Act trials of 1949 and 1951.
Wow.
And ever since then, I've been using these oral histories and the existing research to explain in my dissertation what I call the many worlds of American communism. I came across this weird phrase in a PhD dissertation on communist women that said something around the lines like, quote, just like scholars have shown that there are many worlds of McCarthyism, there are also likely many worlds of the communist experience that has yet to be discussed. So that's where my dissertation got its title. That's what I'm trying to explain. The experiences of women in a male-dominated ideology, the experiences of minorities in a movement that considers their plight secondary to class antagonisms, the experiences of labor activists who are at times at odds with their political leaders, experiences of political communists who acted independent at the district or local level as opposed to obeying the national party line, experiences of fighting racism on the basis of communist logic as opposed to ethics and morality, et cetera, et cetera. All of these different worlds of experiences, I think, helps break down the kind of monolith that people have in their mind of communism as this sort of big hierarchical order.
and something that's just taking its marching orders from Moscow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much trying to break that myth, while at the same time acknowledging that there is some overt connections, such as the Communist International.
Yeah. So yeah, I when you were talking about the oral history, I do remember right around the time that Occupy Chicago started. So that would have been like 2011 or so. The People's World, the CPUSA's now online newspaper, had basically a writer's workshop. So they had found different people, and I was in Central Florida at the time organizing with the CPU down there. And so we went to Chicago, and it was late the night before Occupy Chicago started, and me and one of the other guys who were there just were kind of snooping around in the library that they have in the room. That's I don't remember where the building was located, but we ended up finding a lot of the old newspapers that went back like very far. And it was awesome. Like we were there probably till like 5 or 6 in the morning, just like looking at things and taking pictures and all that kind of stuff. And so
it's a heck of a lot of fun, isn't it?
Oh man, it was really amazing. It was actually fun to like track when you could see when obviously like certain important events happen, not just by the date, but how the paper changed and how the lines changed. And it was very interesting to see it almost not in real time, but by turning pages. It was really that was a special moment for me. Actually, it's a memory I cherish, because it was amazing. It was incredible to look, and that's this sort of written history, or a written history of the propaganda, at least that was being put out by the Communist Party. So it was awesome. It was
very fascinating stuff to go through.
It was great. So I guess to me, obviously, it makes sense to start sort of at the beginning. And so, when did the sort of ideas of communism, not even, I don't mean, they may even be sort of pre-Marxian, but yeah, especially the ideas of like Marxian communist, or these communist ideas, when do they, sort of, I guess, appear in the American historical record?
Well, if we think about the sort of Marxian sense that you're talking about, so ideas that we might classify as communist in the way that Marx thought of communism, especially like in his early writings on civil society, they were in the United States as early as 1848, when a group of German immigrants, a very large group of German immigrants, moved over en masse due to the very same political purge in Germany that caused Marx to flee after writing the Communist Manifesto.
They're the 48ers, right?
Yeah, they're the 48ers. That's what they became known as. This is the origin of what I like to call the pan-socialist left in the United States, although I'm not the one to coin that term, and I'm sure that some would point to earlier groups like from the 1820s, but these German immigrants who were the 48ers were kind of the ones who really brought with them that Marxian kind of communism. It's not to say that there weren't tendencies for socialist practices in the United States before that. There certainly were. But with the emphasis on organizing in enclaves across the nation where they could keep ties with each other, and building an actual movement of individuals, originated kind of around 1848. Mixed along with them were anarchists. A lot of them were fond of Marx's early writings. And a lot of these immigrants and their sons would go on to build the Knights of Labor in the 1860s and 70s.
And the Knights of Labor being, I mean, is that essentially the first, at least large, organized labor organization in the U.S.?
Well, the Knights of Labor were created kind of around the same time that the American Federation of Labor was created, except as you probably know, the AFL started off as a purely craft-based union. And the Knights of Labor believed that you didn't have to have an exclusion on membership in a union. All that it mattered was kind of the Marxist argument of, are you selling your labor or are you not selling your labor? So the Knights of Labor kind of by the 1860s and 70s began to enshroud that image, but they also carried with them a little bit of the like intense radical subversiveness that I hate to use this comparison, but it's the only one that kind of fits, oddly. which is the KKK. They would, ride around at nighttime, fully dressed in clothing so you couldn't see their face. They were fond of organizing in very militant style fashions. That they tipped off the federal government a few times. So they were closer to the more militant kind of activism than you would see in the Socialist Party and the Communist Party later on.
Were they less less craft based than the AFL? So eventually you have something like the IWW, which is just like it. We're not interested in what trade it's the idea of like a one big union. Is that more of the idea behind the Knights of Labor? Like, it doesn't really matter what you're doing as long as you're selling it, as compared to
a little bit.
Okay.
A little bit like that. The big difference, I would say, is that the Knights of Labor would kind of be like, if all the shoemakers want to have their own union, then fine.
Okay. Gotcha. What happened to the Knights of Labor?
Well, by the late 1870s, they started to kind of fall apart. And this is when the origin of the more dominant socialist parties came about, which I think I have a few key documents, especially like the Socialist Labor Party. Like, if you were to think about like what's the first socialist party in the entire country, is the Knights of Labor classifiable as a political party? Not necessarily. Again, they're a little bit more of a kind of ragtag group of people trying to organize, not so much against the state, but against the AFL and against, organized business. So by, 1879, 1880, a lot of this is starting to give way to the more political side of the movement. And people are beginning to organize more into socialist clubs, socialist labor parties, etc. So the Socialist Labor Party itself was established in 1887. So they kind of, had a little bit of overlap there. But by, 1880, 1881, most of the people active in the Knights of Labor had shuffled over to the political movement.
All right. Yeah, so I think one thing that's helpful in terms of like framing it too is to kind of understand. I mean, I was history, studied history in college and high school, and the period of time between Reconstruction and World War I is, a single short paragraph in American history textbooks. It's not really a period of time that most people, really, I think, do a lot of studying on. And I think part of it is because the two things that to me are representative of that sort of period of American history is the construction of the sort of Jim Crow apartheid state and massive labor unrest and violence. And so it's interesting to me, and I'd be interested, from your background in history, the idea that this is a really important period of time to understand the genuine history of the United States, and it's a period of time that is sort of glossed over. So I wonder.
Well, you're certainly right about its significance. This very question itself was one of my comprehensive PhD examination questions. How do you understand the role of industrial development in the United States between Reconstruction and World War I as endemic of the development of a modern labor movement? It is very much glossed over. Why is it glossed over? That's a question I've wondered for a long time, and I don't actually have an answer to why it's glossed over. But what I do know is, as you kind of said, it is important for people to understand a few key things about that period of time. So this is like 1871, 72, all the way up to about 1912-ish. And numerous groups come to mind when I think about this time period. The Knights of Labor, American Federation of Labor, Greenbackers, Farmers Alliance, People's Party, eventually the Socialist Party. So there was this one scholar, H.W. Brands. He argued in his book, The Triumph of Capitalism, that in order to build a modern capitalist society in the United States, it had to fully end the system of slavery in the South, as Marx said, with, quote, the supremacy of the wage labor North. So this meant not only, politically defeating the Confederacy, but also genuinely uprooting its entire mode of production and implementing wage labor across the board.
Gotcha.
And as we see this from 1885 to 1900, the production of steel booms. It goes crazy, and it even doubles just from 1889 to 1900 alone. And by 1901, the United States is outproducing the entire continent of Europe on the production of iron, steel, and coal. Like, this is what Emanuel Wallerstein described as the fundamental shift of capital out of Europe into the New World, when the United States became the new core of this capitalist world system. Another scholar, a Russian scholar named Sven Beckert, argued that the solidification of wage labor as the mode of production by 1900 pitted the sort of big business types of New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago against all these working classes of the areas due to their differences in interests. Now, what do I mean by that? Working class Americans in the North and in the South had virtually the same demands in terms of economic needs. By 1919, advancements in technology and medicine, all of this demonstrated pretty significant improvements in the standard of living and the sustainability of life for the average American. But despite these increases in productive capacity, the raw production of surplus value, increase of the GDP, and an increase of standard of living, annual wages changed very little. So in 1887, the average American worker was making $506, I believe it was, a year. In 1919, that was $660. So we have a huge period of time there in which the amount of money that people are taking home is not a lot, despite all these advancements being seen. And it's right there that people need to understand the significance of the context of the situation. So you can't understand where the socialist movement comes from unless you understand the plight of those original socialists, most of whom were working class, first, second, and third generation immigrants, and grew up watching, slavery end, watching capitalism grow up in the South and, produce vast amounts of productivity, but very little substantial change in actual money and spending power of the working class. That's the conditions that these original socialists grew up in.
Yeah. So, and I think the when you have this movement and consolidation of wage labor throughout the entire country, the other thing that you have this sort of natural products of capitalist development, which is the rapid industrial growth that comes with a significant tendency for monopolization and the maintenance of exactly what you're describing, sort of low wages. And that's when you get the issues of trust that would become a focus of like the progressive era and things like that. But also the robber barons, in terms of oil and the steel production and all of these hugely important sort of natural resource based extractive wealth creation machines. Like you're saying, the result is a significant, and this will sound familiar, I think, but a significant increase in wealth for a very, very small number of people, while the vast majority do see probably some modicum of improvement in their conditions, but not at all relative to the amount of wealth that's created by that development. And I think what's also sort of, and then you also have crises that come out of, so there's just crises after crises in the United States, and I remember reading in textbooks when I was younger, they were called panics. Because you don't call them depressions or something like that. It's a panic. There's bank runs and there's all kinds of massive instability. So you have no real wage growth, massive wealth creation that's going to a few amount of people, and crisis after crises. And it does sound pretty familiar. But
and I think it's one thing to add to that is it's important to say, aside from the fact that they were watching people make a lot of money off of this and they weren't seeing as much of it, it's that society, through its culture, through the media, through newspapers and everything, was constantly reaffirming this idea that the United States is becoming this new great power and advancing far beyond Europe. but then again, people are still going home to the same amount of money. So it's a combination of seeing your boss get richer and society tell you that you're better off, but you actually don't really feel it in your life.
Right. And you did mention it, but I think, obviously in terms of both the import and the kind of movers and shakers of the socialist, especially the early sort of socialist movement, were a lot of immigrants, people coming, to the United States from Europe and other places. And so I wonder, if you can give a little bit of sort of a background on the sort of role of immigration in both bringing and then sort of advancing, Marxist ideas. One thing that comes to my mind, is you look at the Haymarket posters, and it's in English and in German and things like that. And so the talk about, be interesting to hear about the role of immigration in terms of the sort of Marxist history of the movement.
Well, the immigration certainly plays a fundamental role, partially because of what I already mentioned with the 1848ers. German immigrants coming over here and continuing to come over here from 1848 throughout 1849, and then again during Reconstruction. Those individuals were central to a lot of the groups, such as the Knights of Labor, and kind of maintaining some element of an active movement. So you have to remember that a lot of these Germans who came over from Europe were already they were fleeing political persecution. So they were already part of a kind of political cohort that were coming out here. And when they came out here, it's not like they all just went into a big diaspora. They came over here and picked certain communities to live in so that they could stay with families and friends that they knew. And that's how they built that community and that, early precursor to what we might call the socialist or communist movement in the United States. By the time you get to the Haymarket Affair is kind of the culmination of all these different ethnic groups coming together. Slavs, Poles, German, Irish immigrants, all kind of looking for ways to make their plight clear. And especially by the time that the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs comes around, that creates a political platform that kind of de-emphasizes the role of ethnicity, tries to make it all come together a little bit. That's also where I forget his name. Daniel de Leon comes together, which is a de-emphasis on working in exclusively ethnic-based unions or ethnic-based party groups and trying to work as one homogenous organization. Then, obviously, by the time we get to the 1910s, World War I, you have the left wing of this socialist party, most of whom are of a foreign language. They speak a foreign language, but not necessarily are they first-generation immigrants. A lot of them are actually second-generation immigrants, Slavics. And they go on to push the left wing of the Socialist Party into splitting. They don't actually want to split it first, but it ends up being the directional path that they take. And for as much as I've read about the history of the subsequent CPUSA, the subsequent Socialist Party, they have always retained a predominant presence of immigrants. Probably the most underlooked or underexamined group of immigrants in this history would be Mexican Americans. There are tremendous amounts of Mexican Americans who did a lot of work in the 1930s for communist unionists, communist political activism groups that just completely go under the radar. Emma Tenuaca, for example, Luisa Moreno, both in Los Angeles. But so, in other words, the short answer to the question is they have always formed a fundamental core of the movement. It has the socialist movement or the pan-socialist left, whatever you want to call it, has certainly never been a homogenous single ethnic movement ever.
Which is, the obvious sort of there's strength in diversity, and the different experiences of different people inform all of the different ways, in some ways that is spoken of in the language of like intersectionality or something right now. But the way that those different experiences, I think it's important too to understand that there's a place where they can find that commonality and the ability to work together, and it's shown itself to be the case in terms of the history of American socialism. And I think that's sort of important for me. It's a little bit going backwards, but and I think you had kind of said too that this might be something that you could talk for a while about. But one thing that I'm constantly fascinated by is the sort of role of socialist ideas in the Civil War. So before the sort of period of industrialization and violence and consolidation of wage labor in the South, but because the Communist Manifesto comes out in 1848, and then you got a 20-year period. The revolutions of 1848, happen in that period of time, are sort of put down. There's a consolidation, building its way up to what would happen in the Paris Commune in the 1870s. So in the 1860s, you've already said the ideas have already been brought by 48ers and other people, and so and there's obviously a lot of a famous letter that Marx wrote to Abraham Lincoln. So I wonder if you could enlighten us a little bit more about the kind of role of these ideas in the U.S. Civil War.
Yes, this is definitely an area that I could go on for hours about, particularly because I have done research in this area. I have an article written up on it. It is unfortunately an area of scholarship that is only recently being unearthed. By recent, I mean within the past 20 years. It's not significantly looked at, and people are only just within the past 5 years beginning to look at all of Marx's writings in the Viennese newspaper Die Presse, which he wrote on, and pretty much all that he wrote on was the American Civil War. I can remember back in 2008, knowing very little about Marx and his involvement in the Civil War other than what was published in the Marxist collected works. In 2008, however, a few scholars, such as Robin Blackburn, began to look at correspondence letters, and there was actually 3 of them. There is one very famous correspondence letter, but there's actually 3 letters between Marx and Lincoln. And after doing some digging, it became known that there was this article written in John Welsh for Political Quarterly, something like that, in 2002, about how Marx altered his manuscript for Das Kapital just weeks after having a letter with Lincoln. And then here's where everything began to get interesting.
This is a letter exchange between the two? So did Abraham Lincoln write to Marx?
I don't believe that it was an exchange. I believe it was letters exclusively to Lincoln.
Gotcha.
If there was one going back from Lincoln, I'm not
gone.
100% sure about.
Yeah. Okay.
So
it's where it gets interesting.
Yeah, where it gets interesting is, prior to the Civil War, Marx's interest in the American socioeconomic order and civil society appeared as kind of a comparison to Tsarist Russia. He made a lot of very kind of exaggerated comparisons to the growing number of slave rebellions in the South and the execution of abolitionist John Brown with the breakdown of leading families in Russia. And he kind of concluded that this is evidence that, quote, a real social movement is beginning in the West and the East. And so during the Civil War, he wrote for this, like I said, a Viennese paper called Die Presse, Diepresse, where he published a series of articles on, I believe it was from October of 1861 till November of 1862, November or December of 1862. In the articles, he outlined 3 fundamental observations that have since become canon to Marxist philosophy. And while people kind of accepted it as canon afterward, nobody really gave a lot of agency to the Civil War in kind of spawning this new understanding. So first, he argued that slavery would never destroy itself by some virtue of morality or ethics, the way that Republicans believed. Socioeconomic systems and their dependent governments do not ever want to, quote, wither away. They fight continuously to recreate the conditions whereby their ongoing rule, or whatever you want to call it, can be sustained. So in short, Marx summarized what he later explained in Das Kapital about how economic systems are not blind to their own internal contradictions. They are, in fact, so aware of them that they actively seek means to avoid them or to at least minimize their effects. This was then later interpreted by Lenin to be the foundation of the whole principle of vanguardism, that true revolutionaries can never hope for capitalism to just die off or wither away, that capitalist society must be fought against with some sort of full force. So second, and sort of building off of that first one, Marx argued that a social experiment was being unveiled by the development of US politics between 1855 and 1861. That the capitalist, quote, wage labor North was preparing for an inevitable battle with the, quote, backward slave economy of the South. Marx described the border states. If you're unfamiliar with what the border states are, they're kind of the states that were not fully chosen as being part of the Confederacy, but they also didn't want to declare themselves as, a northern free state. They had mixed laws about how free labor could function there. Well, Marx described them as, quote, a region in which the system of slavery and the system of free market labor exist side by side and contend for mastery. So the crux of this political situation here that Marx was almost aware of probably even before Lincoln was that the Southern states' resistance to the abolitionist movement had much less to do with morality and the ethics of slavery than it had to do with the desire to expand their socioeconomic order. So if the North expanded west, for example, they would quickly outnumber the slave states in Congress and uproot the entire political balance that had existed from 1800 to 1855. Likewise, if the slave states expanded west, the North was at risk of losing its political control over wage labor production. So Marx depicted the Civil War as a battle between these two economic systems, slavery and capitalism, and hinted that the reason these two systems are at odds with each other has nothing to do with, the notions of liberty and equality and stuff like that. Rather, it all rested on the political power that was to be gained by expanding their economic system. To fully negate this role of morality, Marx pointed to how Great Britain did not hesitate in backing the Confederacy once they saw that their need of cotton was threatened by the blockade set up by Lincoln. So finally, the last point that he argued, building off of points 1 and 2, Marx concludes that the only way for any economic system to survive is to expand. That in order for slavery to survive in the United States, it cannot win a political battle. It has to try and expand, just like the North. They have to pit themselves against the alternative and beat them out. This, Marx said, was the true nature of the American Civil War. To try and put to rest any idea that Lincoln was an abolitionist from start to end, Marx would just point to the federal incentives that he offered in March of 1962 to try and encourage border states to abolish slavery on their own. So, he said, if you want to know how a socioeconomic order responds to threats from the outside, you look at the American Civil War, because that was the only time when you're going to see the political regime kind of somewhat removed from the more dominant fight going on, which is the battle over production.
That's a fascinating perspective on what the Civil War is, especially in terms of the way that, in relation to how it's discussed and seen and sort of understood in sort of mainstream even historiography around the Civil War, which is this sort of being dragged into it. Lincoln I would do anything to I'll keep slavery if I'll keep preserve the Union and all this and then begrudgingly getting into the war and then coming radicalized by the experience and that it's all in this sort of we're saying that it's this notion of liberty and these ideas that were supposedly these foundational ideas of the country, and then you have a significant period where it's sort of quite obviously not true. But that is a very, for lack of a better term, sort of bourgeois perspective. Let's look at the ideas. Let's talk about the ideals that we still feel fuel our sort of underlying liberalism, and it'll all kind of fit into this nice little story about the inevitable progression towards utopia that is the United States. And I think looking at it as something much more fundamental in terms of, as one would expect, I guess, of Marx, a question of class struggle and of the idea of the competition between two different kind of economic orders with the same kind of necessity for expansion coming together, and like you were saying, the political that's the actual center of the class struggle, instead of it being somehow politicized, which I think it can often be. And so
yes, very much so. I would also, in my opinion, like this was also kind of what my article was trying to get at, is, part of what Marx's writings in De Presse and his letter to Lincoln suggest is this idea that, if you're familiar with Das Kapital, you're familiar with his argument that profit rates have a tendency to fall.
Mm-hmm.
And, economists were always quick to point out, well, that's a closed economic loop. Like, that'll happen in a closed economic loop, of course. But, what, macroeconomic system functions that way? You have to think about the broader context here. Well, part of what Marx unearths in that general argument that in order to survive, an economic system must expand. It can't just politically pit itself against its enemy. It has to literally expand its productive capacity over the enemy in order to do that. That right there enshrines the notion that you can have declining profit rates. You can have a tendency for profit rates to fall, but none of that matters if you're constantly expanding the economy. If you expand the economy at a rate that offsets the declining profit rates, the declining profit rate doesn't make any difference. And I think that's what is really important about Marx's saying there. And he doesn't actually say it himself, because he concludes that bit later in Das Kapital. Mm-hmm. But I kind of see the origin of his logic in his writings in De Presse on the Civil War.
So yeah, it's the very American influence on Das Kapital. The constant connections back to America.
I can't remember what his name was. It was Sven Beckert pointed out that, right after his last letter to Lincoln, and right after his last publication in De Presse, he goes back and he makes a letter that he sends to Engels, and then he sends to his head editor for Das Kapital, and he says, I have to change everything. I have to completely redo my entire manuscript. I have to reorganize it. I have to add in a chapter. The chapter that he added in was chapter 10, The Working Day.
Mm.
And Sven Beckert goes through this kind of lengthy process to explain how that particular aspect of, or that particular chapter is broken down into relations to the Civil War. I think it's a little bit too much of a comparison, but it is important to note that Das Kapital was completely restructured and a chapter was added in as a result of what was going on in the American Civil War.
I think that it's also helpful there to realize that, you use the word canon, and I think there is a notion of a sort of canonization of a few central ideas, and I don't necessarily oppose it, but at the same time, there is a tendency for dogmatism that I think that certain experiences, definitely of like 20th century socialism and some of those kind of experiences, were in some ways using either Marx or even Lenin or something as a bit of gospel, and a sort of like, if you could just memorize these like formulaic kind of things, then you can get by. And it just shows that Marx himself, didn't have that kind of approach. It's like, oh, I can see something happening that changes my ideas, and it's going to result in a significant change in what I'm doing, but that's what you got to do. I mean, that's
very
part
true.
of being that having that dialectical materialist approach, is that the whole idea is that things are always changing. There's always that dialectical movement that if you think it somehow stops, or that you've got your finger on everything that you need, you're going to be quickly disappointed by the movement of the dialectic.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I have this little cliche phrase that I like to say. I go, whoever came up with the phrase, "the only constant is change," was most certainly a Marxist.
Absolutely. So, moving sort of forward in time, then the period of definitely like the late 1880s to up to the Civil War, but definitely to the turn of the century, you have some fairly sort of, in some ways, three things that I sort of want to highlight, which one of them is the Haymarket affair, and so I want to talk a little bit about that, but at the same time, sort of wrapping that in with the Pullman strike and the sort of role that Eugene Debs sort of played in that, and as well as the I want to talk about the book Looking Backwards by Edward Bellamy, which was like the third bestseller at the time, competing with Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ben-Hur. And so just in terms of the sort of really burning hot flame of the U.S. labor sort of struggles and the sort of socialist influence of that in terms of like in Chicago, on the railroads, and even in books.
Well, starting with the kind of what I think is the first one in your timeline of things that you listed there, the Haymarket affair, what I like to call the real Labor Day. I love to talk about Haymarket simply because it is one of the greatest ironies about both U.S. history and the history of communism as a global movement. May Day, also known as International Workers' Day, as you probably know, is a worldwide celebration on May 1st. It's conducted by numerous first, second, third world nations, including, where's this little list here? Britain, Finland, Estonia, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Bulgaria, Spain, Poland, Canada, Mexico, Algeria, Egypt, Kenya, Libya, Nigeria, Brazil, Ecuador, El Salvador. I could keep going. The list is huge.
Yep. We do a May Day here in DC. It's big.
Yeah, but we do not celebrate it as a actual holiday.
Right.
So the Haymarket affair, to go over my understanding of it, the Haymarket affair is the origin of the modern day celebration of May Day, as the date also has held significance for ethnic groups dating back to a few hundred years earlier. It all went down in Chicago, 1886. I believe it was a Tuesday or a Thursday. I think it was a Tuesday. For weeks, the working people of the greater Chicago area, who at this time were mostly coal miners, farmers, transport merchants, that sort of stuff. The event was the culmination of a series of attempts after the Civil War to lessen the work week from 60 hours. At the same time, everyone was also working 6 days per week. To make matters more complicated, workers were paid differently on average based on not only their location, but also their ethnicity. So early union attempts in an era that lacked union protection rights very quickly resulted in firing, blacklisting, the occasional use of violence from privately hired security forces, etc. So Haymarket is kind of the point where the pot just started to boil over. People had reached the point where they were actually willing to go and risk getting arrested, because I'm pretty sure that everyone at least knew that they would attract the attention of authorities. Whether or not anyone would die, I don't think that anybody expected that. So they staged a peaceful protest in Haymarket Square. It was led by three groups. One of them was the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions. It was led by a man named Albert Parsons. But there was a lot of other groups that were in it. If you were to go there today, by the way, the part of Chicago that it's in, you would not ever think that this was the hub of some sort of huge riot. These days, Haymarket Square is home to the most hip craft breweries and create your own burger joints. Like it's really weird to go there, but they have a nice little monument.
Yeah, I've been there. It's very nice. Story. Yeah.
Workers staged what was essentially a massive sit-in, though no one was required to literally sit down. The goal was simply to thwart the ability for the merchants to conduct all of their business. Some of the workers there shifted from a previous strike that was broken up by city police at the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. And this is where Albert Parsons and his kind of union group came into play. Parsons gave a speech that was essentially calling for change without the need of the government. So saying people shouldn't have to go to their government to get change. They should be able to demand it from their employers. Numerous other speeches were given, especially where the 8-hour working day was emphasized. This is the origin of that concept of the 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for whatever we will. But it was by 10:30 at night when the police arrived. They cornered off the 4-section interchange And if you're familiar with the area, you would know that when you corner off this particular area of Chicago, the buildings themselves make it next to the river, make it impossible to go anywhere else. So you were literally stuck in that area. And it was in that moment that somebody threw a homemade bomb into the police crowd, killing one of the policemen, wounding 6 others. To this day, we still do not know who threw the bomb, nor which side they were on. One could speculate that it was the anarchists or socialists who were throwing it, and that's kind of guilt by association because they're the only ones who really had a reason to do so. But what we also know for certain is that city police and city employers of the area had spies within Parsons organizations for months leading up to the event. And they all had orders to take steps to dismantle this union. Now, whether or not those steps implied shooting and killing police, I don't know. I highly doubt that. But we do know that there's a little bit of suspicion about the whole affair. The response by police officers, obviously, after being shot, was to blindly open fire into the crowd. They killed 4 workers and injured, I think, about 14 or 15 others. The people who died at the event were known as the Haymarket Martyrs. Their blood stained Haymarket Square for about 6 weeks. It took the city a lot of work to get rid of it. And that is actually the reason why communism and socialism all rally behind the color red. That's why the Soviet Union's flag was red. It was representative of the blood of the Haymarket Martyrs. The very next day, the whole city turned into kind of a virtual war between city police and the straw man of anarchists, even though they couldn't pinpoint any particular person or group. At the time, the word socialist was not very common, and the word communist was almost like completely outside the vernacular of the average American. But anarchist served as a sort of generic term for anyone who refused to put up with the system or refused to play by, quote, the rules. And in this sense, it did not matter to employers or police what these people actually believed. It only mattered if that they wanted to break or alter the rules. The subsequent Red Scare is often underemphasized in history. And by underemphasized, I mean we have a lot of categories in U.S. history for the first and second Red Scares, 1919, 1946, but we do not consider the backlash against anarchism and labor unions in 1886 as a real, genuine Red Scare. Though I'm sure someone has labeled it on Wikipedia or whatnot, but we just don't call it that in the classroom. And I think that's something that should probably change. Let's see. What else about Haymarket? I guess the most significant aspect of Haymarket is how it impacted the way other nations viewed the United States. So Great Britain celebrates May Day on the basis of supporting labor and working people as the bulwark of what makes any nation strong. Germany likewise prides itself on its celebration of working people. France celebrates the linking of democratic ideals in France with the working class tenacity for social justice at Haymarket. My favorite, however, has to be the Soviet Union. Part of me feels like this was always some sort of huge international trolling effort on behalf of the Soviets. Part of me also feels that they genuinely respected the Haymarket affair, but the Soviet Union turned May Day into their single largest holiday. It trumped every major event, including their own version of the 4th of July, which would be like celebrating the October Revolution.
Right.
It trumped their celebration of defeating Hitler. Like it was their number one day. May Day is the day that most Americans are familiar with in the Soviet Union. The day that Stalin and the other Soviet dictators would stand out on their balcony and watch the tanks and missiles drive by. All of this in every single country is related to an event that happened right here in the United States in Chicago. Yet still to this day, we very much refuse to acknowledge that date as a significant moment in U.S. history. Again, it's one of the greatest ironies.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, in terms of the role of the United States at that particular time, as in some ways the leader of the sort of worldwide push against the results of 50 years or so of this kind of capitalist development, and I think the experience of the recognition of that from other people is something that we should pride ourselves on. But I mean, in some ways, without being too like Gramscian and talking about cultural hegemony and all those kinds of things, it has to be in some ways the result of a considered and intentional campaign to not talk about those things.
Yeah, it's certainly one way to see it.
So the what do you know about so the next thing in that timeline, right? You have Haymarket in 1886.
Yes.
And then Looking Backwards comes out in 1888. So what can you tell us about this Looking Backwards?
So Bellamy's work, which I've only read once, but I'm familiar that it is sometimes considered the origin of the American Socialist movement, which I have my own reservations about why I think that's inaccurate. But it's nevertheless, it's important to consider culture and how that impacts the social consciousness. It did have some important impacts on the development of communist ideology, but its role in history, again, as I feel, is kind of over dramatized. So historians of the New Left, that is the kind of the people who reacted against the quote old guard historians prior to 1960, believe that Bellamy's work spawned the political movement that became the Socialist Party of 1912. Now, the Socialist Party was started in 1901, but by 1912, the Socialist Party had become this massive, tremendous movement that could wield 1 million votes in the national election. But by toning down the romanticism of the book, which is without a doubt one of the best early science fiction novels I've read from the early period of science fiction, we can get a more broad understanding of both the book and the political movement that kind of grew up around it. So, like I said before, much of the origin of all these socialist ideals came from German immigrants in the 1848ers. Even Christian socialists in the Deep South who dreamed of a world where, poverty or without property, people could more effectively worship God. These people also borrowed their ideals from immigrants more so than they did from high culture. So a lot of these people did not go look into books. They didn't go read the Communist Manifesto to go understand this stuff.
Yeah.
Now, the significance of Bellamy's book, I think, rests in how it transformed the idea into an imaginative future. So suddenly, through prose and narrative, people could imagine what a socialist society was like. It was no longer, reading words from a German philosopher who's, highly educated, uses very kind of jargonesque language. It doesn't sound like that. It's written in a down-to-earth, reflective manner that people can then use to imagine what this society is. And I think that this is the real positive thing because it's opposite to the traditional Marxist sense, which is to be negative. So the Marxist argument is, quote, because capitalism is unsustainable, an alternative must be achieved. So that it's ingrained in negativity. So this is negative, so an alternative must replace it. So that's, I feel, the real value of Bellamy's work. He turned an idea into a conscious ideology that had achievements beyond just the destruction of capitalism. He tried to envision what the world would be like after you had already gotten rid of the defects of capitalism. So in that sense, I'm kind of categorizing Bellamy's work into a lot of other science fiction, which is it contains visions of the future. It gives people the ability to imagine what this society might look like, while also giving them the ability to judge it and to determine if they like what the society might be like. And if that's not the case, maybe we can still work for the same goal, but avoid these particular aspects of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that, and I mean, I think it's interesting because there was at the time like this sort of like little subgenre of like utopian sort of novels and a lot of the sort of like utopian socialist novels. And so it's this like it is the sort of science fiction, and it does read very, it's an easy read. And the other book that I read, and I've read a few times because I just enjoy the prose, is William Morris's News from Nowhere. And that was was written in response to, and you pronounce it probably correctly, Bellamy. I always just say Bellamy because I can't, terrible pronunciation.
Yeah, Bellamy is how I remember being about it.
So, but it's in Morris's was in some ways a response to it, and so his is a deindustrialized socialist society in like England, and whereas Bellamy's book is it's very industrial. It does have this like, there's sort of a credit card type of thing, and there's like big box stores like a Costco or something, and so there's a lot of like very interesting ideas in terms of a speculative fiction kind of futuristic but utopian view. And I think it's sort of telling about how, to me, like it just tells it is an aspect of the aspirational feeling about the ideas of socialism at the time. You're feeling like you're on a rising tide. You've got setbacks, but you've got all these examples of a growing movement where you feel like you're actually making a significant amount of change and building a significant amount of power. And so, yeah, by using a plot device where you basically kind of don't really have to talk about the dirty revolutionary bits, and you can kind of skip over it and just say like, look what you could do. I think is something that was a lot of what people were looking for then, but I also think it's what people are looking for now. And there's been this serious period of history since the end of World War II of dystopian novels, and that have really grown recently, especially like the post 2008 recession, where you have these huge, the Hunger Games and all that kind of stuff. And so in my mind, there does need to be a utopian book or TV show or something like that that could give people the same kind of thing, I don't want to over exaggerate the power of a book or a movie to motivate something, but to give people something that they could believe in. And if you were doing it from a socialist or perspective, one of the questions that you always get is, how could it work? What would it look like? What are you fighting for? You're always, and like you were saying, it's always what you're fighting against. It's always what you don't like. What do you want? What do you want to build? What does it look like? And I think that's a legitimate sort of criticism. And one of the things that I do like about looking backwards, even just it's a good story, is the what it's able to kind of show in terms of a vision of a future that could actually be built, and that's actually pretty badass. And so I think it would be awesome if someone were to do something like that. You do have a lot of really good authors who would call themselves socialists and even Marxists and stuff, and I really think something like that is sort of needed.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. The one thing that that kind of really eggs me about that kind of desire, which I agree with you, I would love to have that, but Bellamy's work also came out in a much different time.
Mm-hmm.
What do I mean by that? I mean, people at that time were talking about something that they could not ever see. Like, they had never seen socialism, even in narrative form. And so seeing it that way, it's kind of like, if you can imagine it, you can do it. Like, that's the message that Bellamy is trying to deliver there.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also talking at a time when no one has seen any kind of effects of socialist or communist movements or regimes at all.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're living in a world where, it is just as easy to point out that, yeah, you can have these utopian books talking about a sustainable socialist future, but you're going to have a whole cohort of people always there pointing to the failures of the Soviet Union,
Venezuela,
of China, of all these other groups. So that's the uniqueness of Bellamy's work, is that it comes at a time when people had not visioned socialism, and he put it into the narrative form and the prose so that people could kind of get an understanding of it in their minds.
Yeah, I think that is really important. If something like that, something analogous to that were to even be able to come out or something, it would have to deal significantly with that. And I think either, the difficulty with that is that either you'll get eyes glossing over, or you'll get, I think in some ways an instant reversion. And so yeah, it does have a different kind of. We're in obviously a different
weird
context.
Time.
Yeah, exactly. It's very weird with an election of somebody like Donald Trump. I remember seeing in the Rage Against the Machine video where they shut down the stock exchange.
Yeah, they say elect Donald Trump.
There's a guy with a sign that says like, yeah, Donald Trump for president or something like that. And I always remember being like, what a fucking joke that would, that's so ridiculous. And then, but yeah,
and here we are.
Yeah. All right. So the last thing, and I think the what I'm kind of seeing here is a way of talking about the origin of the sort of Socialist Party of Daniel de Leon and of Debs and that kind of sort of history. So maybe starting with either 1890, or if you want to do from 1894 and the Pullman strike.
I'm actually going to throw a curveball at you and start a little bit earlier.
Okay, do it.
Because this question, what is the first socialist party? It's an interesting question because it forces you to throw up for judgment the entire definition of socialist. For example, the term socialist does not become colloquial terminology until around 1850. Nevertheless, we can see organizations as early as 1829, such as the Committee of 50 in New York, who advocated principles such as the abolition of private property. They slated individuals for election on the platform of ending banking monopolies. So there's two ways to answer it: socialist by definition and socialist by consciousness, meaning that they were conscious in their advocacy for socialism. By definition, the Working Men's Party, founded in 1829, was arguably the first socialist political party in the United States. But as I've already stated, this was not socialist philosophy in the modern sense that we might call it. Their socialism amounted to getting candidates on the New York State Assembly, advocating an end to political factionalism, and ending working class or electing working class professionals such as Thomas Skidmore. He was a machinist, to office. So they wanted to see like working class people in office. They wanted to see an end to like the kind of bureaucratic party thing that was developing in New York at the time. The party, however, died off around 1831 due to the same deficiency of most of these early movements. And I don't want to try and put too much agency on Marx here, but a lot of these early movements lacked a very clear political program, and they lacked a clear, concrete analysis of their society in which to combat the people that they were against. Had they done so, they probably would have beaten Marx to the punch, but they just didn't have access to the kind of education that Marx had, and they definitely did not have access to the British economy the way that Marx did.
And the British Museum.
Oh, yeah, in Great Britain. So on to the first conscious socialist party that embodied the sort of traditions that we're familiar with. That would be the Socialist Labor Party, the SLP. They were established in 1887. They are still around. They advocate, quote, socialist industrial unionism, which is kind of Marxist jargon for increased agency and authority of industrial unions. The idea here, which Engels called sort of an element of, quote, utopian socialism, was that by organizing workers into unions and giving them as much agency as they could force employers to cave in on demands. This also became the central argument for most post-Reconstruction union efforts. Obtain recognition from the state, then begin to organize your union and bargain with your employers. The SLP would go on to split into two federations by 1889, after the Haymarket Affair. Those who left went on to form the precursors of the Socialist Party of the United States. So this latter group is the party of Debs, who got nearly 1 million votes in the 1912 election. All of these are the origins of the most significant socialist political organization in American history, which is the SPA. The SPA kind of fell apart in the 1970s and later rebuilt itself back up into the Socialist Party of the United States of America. But the Socialist Labor Party, still to this day, is the oldest socialist party in the nation and the second oldest one on earth.
Crazy.
Now, these two individuals, so we've got Daniel de Leon and Eugene Debs. So de Leon led that SLP party. for years, from 1890 to 1900, I want to say, maybe a couple of years before that.
I think so.
But he edited the party's major paper, the Weekly People. He tried to link the various ethnic groups of the American working class by facilitating both German, Polish, and English-speaking circulations of the paper. While he was in charge of the paper, he also tried to work to end these sort of utopian approaches to unionism and emphasize instead a Marxist interpretation of literally overthrowing capitalism as both an economic system and a political regime. In other words, don't just organize in unions, don't just organize in the elections, do it all as one big movement. We need to do it all together. When he tried to create a bridge between the SLP and the Knights of Labor, who were pretty fond of harassing and threatening businessmen, they kind of went at odds with each other. The Knights didn't really want to accept de Leon's party as, they believed that they were a little bit reformist, too reformist, not militant enough. And so de Leon began to look elsewhere. And so in 1904, he attended the International Socialist Congress in Amsterdam, where kind of his entire life direction went down a different path. And he switched to a more rigid focus on exclusive industrial unionism, and he negated the need for working with the state. He actually negated the agency of the state entirely. He worked with the ALU, the American Labor Union, to then form the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, in 1905. He did this with Big Bill Haywood. Eugene Debs was involved. He continued to work with the IWW until, again, like most of these movements do, they kind of fizzle and have fragmentations and splits. His preference to work with the Socialist Labor Party conflicted with the desire of Big Bill Haywood to instigate direct action without a political party. So the IWW was like, we don't need a political party to get involved in action for the workers. Whereas de Leon said we should do that. Like, we don't have to, but we should. So that's where his split occurred. And he tried to create an alternative IWW. It was actually based out of Detroit, here where I currently am. But it faded away in the mid-1920s. If I were to give de Leon kind of a big impact, or like the big significance, would be his redirection from exclusively union or exclusively party efforts. Rather, he desired to use both organizations, the union groups and the political party, to accomplish the same goal via the two systems in place, by attacking the economy, the employers, through the unions, and then the capitalist state through the political parties. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's always what's resonated with me about this sort of de Leonist position, which is that sort of important understanding, and it's easy to sort of forget because both are difficult and sort of big lifts to do in trade union or just like unionism in general, and also like political work in the context of capitalist economics and bourgeois sort of politics, and but the importance of uniting those struggles in a common effort, I think is exactly, I think you're exactly right. That's where he still has value and has an important. I mean, I think it's an often forgotten sort of lesson that De Leon was able to give is make sure you have your eye on both sides of the coin, because if you don't, you end up losing power in one. Power in one translates to the power in the other, and so in order to be able to, but you have to be able to direct both of those in a way that's complementary. And I think it's one lesson I think that I think we'll get to, but there tends to be a focus on one or the other, or you can get down one road because you're having some success and lose sort of sight or perspective of the other. And so I don't know. I just think it's not, people. A lot of people know who Eugene Debs is if they're thinking about American socialism, but I don't think a lot of people think about Daniel De Leon. So it's important.
Yeah, they definitely don't. He's kind of the middle ground between. So if Bill Haywood, who thinks that you don't need a political organization to accomplish goals. So if Bill Haywood's on the left of De Leon and he's in the center, Debs is the one that's on the right, who says, no, you absolutely do need a political discourse and a political movement in order to get this stuff going. And Eugene Debs, I've always kind of, ever since the election of 2016, I've started to describe Eugene Debs as kind of the Bernie Sanders of 1912. So he made the term socialist acceptable in American political discourse at the time. His political platform for the presidency did not hold any reservations back about his goals, which were both long-reaching and unrealistic, but they resonated with enough Americans at the time in both the Republican and the Democratic bases to very seriously destabilize the two mainstream parties. What I mean by that is there are a few scholars recently, as early as I think it was 2013 or 2014 when I saw it in the American Historical Association's journal, the argument that Debs' success in 1912 is what caused the shift in the Democratic Party under Wilson to a more progressive stance. Keeping in mind, Debs did not steal votes from just, quote, working class conservatives or wishy-washy Democrats like we kind of describe things today. He stole votes from both parties by simply appealing to them, forcing the mainstream groups to recess their entire political platforms. And it should be no surprise at all that from 1916 onward, we see consistent appeals to the working class during each and every single presidential election, all the way up to 2016. It's been 100 years since that shift occurred, and it's still going on. But like DeLeon, Debs was a trade unionist, co-founder of the IWW, but unlike DeLeon and Bill Haywood, as I said before, Debs did see the political regime as very central to bringing about change. And he knew this kind of very early on. He started his political career as a Democrat, shifted to socialist groups during the Pullman rail car strike of 1894, which is also the origin of future Communist Party five-time presidential candidate William Foster's understanding of socialism. And after denouncing President Cleveland for breaking up the strike in 1894 and refusing to stand trial for his injunction against the participation in the event, Debs served 6 months in prison. And it was that 6 months in prison that he read the writings of Marx, Engels, and DeLeon. Once he got out, he spent 4 years building the Socialist Democracy of America, then the Socialist Democratic Party of America, until finally settling with the SPA, the Socialist Party of America, in 1901. He ran for president 5 times, 1900, 1904, 1908, the record-setting 1912, and then finally in 1920 after he was released from prison after World War I. And so that was kind of the end of Debs's political career, but Debs really gave the movement the momentum that it had by 1918, 1919, when you then see the emergence of the Communist Party.
And there's one of the sort of, I guess, famous stories that, Debs is arrested during the war because at the time there's essentially a clampdown on free speech. Yeah. And so, made famous speech in Canton, Ohio, is arrested, imprisoned, and then, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but like that he was so popular in the prison that the basically everybody, including the some of the prisoners as well as the warden and a bunch of people, were essentially sad when he eventually got out, because he was such a he had apparently a quite gregarious personality. He was very tall and sort of commanding.
Oh, he was tremendously tall.
Yeah, so like a commanding presence, but one that was able to, I think, connect with regular people in a way that is a very it's not often seen. I like the idea of a Bernie Sanders, like Bernie Sanders 100 years ago, somebody who could speak to you, was a little bit older, could maybe be your grandpa, so I think, that's it's a very apt, and I think, as far as I understand, and I think this is still true, Bernie Sanders has a sort of framed picture of Eugene Debs in his Senate office. So
wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I think the thing is as sort of down on Bernie as many socialists can tend to be. There's definitely an understanding on his part of at least the role of somebody like Eugene Debs. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
you can
that
also make the
they would
comparison to
agree.
Bellamy as well, because Debs, just like Bellamy, spoke with that prose and the kind of common language that people could understand what he meant when he was describing socialism. It did not sound like some Marxist theoretical jargon. It did not sound like, De Leon going over the intricacies of working in both unions and the political sphere, etc. It was a very simple message, almost as simple as Lenin in 1917 when he just says, "Peace and bread." He tried to sum up socialism in basic needs that people could understand.
Right. Yeah. And I think in some ways, speaking of the ability to speak regularly, I think it's Bill Haywood who's one of the quotes I always remember is, I might not have read Marx's Capital, but I have the marks of capital all over me.
I think that was Bill Haywood.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's another person I think. Curious, to hear about the role of the IWW. You talked about how Debs and Bill Haywood and Daniel De Leon were sort of involved in the creation of the industrial workers of the world, but sort of what role did they play in that sort of period of time, and what is the sort of trajectory of the IWW?
I mean, I will be honest. My work on the IWW is probably not as favorable as some of your listeners might prefer, or even you might prefer.
Sure.
The IWW, I have always felt, has been much more of a theoretical genius organization, but a practical failure. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the IWW is founded on a lot of principles that sound great. Like, if to anyone who's a communist or a Marxist or even a democratic socialist, they probably sound like excellent ideas, excellent platforms to go on. But the amount of actual change that they generate and the amount of real improvements that they generate, I think, pales in comparison to the agency that history gives them. I think that some of that agency lies elsewhere in groups like the Socialist Party, in groups like the CPUSA, in groups like the Communist League of America, which is a sect that broke off the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers Party, the Black Marxists that came about later on. I just feel that the IWW, it's more of a theoretical platform, and I've always seen it like that than I've seen it as a practical vehicle for social change.
And I don't totally disagree. I mean, I think it's always been the IWW has had a long and interesting history, and the ideas that motivate it, like you said, I think are very valuable. The impact that it's been able to have as a union and as a large industrial international kind of one big union, the ability to construct that has at minimum not shown itself to have been done with the correct strategy, frankly. And so it is I think it's interesting because the sort of imagery that you might hear in the sort of IWW is this wheel and then a hub and some spokes that connect it. And I think the interesting role that the IWW has really played, more so than being an actual industrial union, is that it can kind of focus as a center of gravity for people who are interested in these kinds of struggles and want to really get involved as a way to find other people who really do. It has, in the places that I've lived, in the circles that I've been in, functioned for that for me. And I think, so that's one reason why I think it's been around as long as it has, and that you find in certain places more or less effective groups in the IWW, but as a large industrial, non-differentiated sort of union that's that's able to, if I were to join the IWW and no one else at my job did, I'm not sure that the IWW would really be able to negotiate my wage for me. And so
Yeah.
I wish it could, but but I'm a little skeptical about that, at least.
Yeah, and you are right. I'm not trying to like remove all agency from the IWW. I mean, without a doubt, I mean, we would not even have the writings of De Leon or some of Debs's early works without the IWW publishing. And the IWW is responsible for publishing a lot of works from intellectual thinkers on socialism that, again, we just would never see that without them, because International Publishers, who was the Moscow-based Soviet publisher, which then later became the kind of domestic U.S. Communist Party-based one, you know, that they didn't publish any of those stuffs, and we wouldn't know anything about it without the IWW publishing them. So.
Yeah, and I think, you know, people like John Reed and stuff had gotten, you know, some experience in organizing with the IWW and stuff like that, and just I'm sure that experience at minimum helped frame their perspective. And, you know, I think 10 Days That Shook the World and stuff. I think there's definitely a role that it's played in terms of at least in some ways finding the right kind of people and organizing in a way that is as effective as it can be, and maybe finding other ways to be more effective.
Yeah. I agree. It definitely was a good organization, and it's a good outlet. Like, if anything, it's the what's the good word? It's the what's the word that they always use for marijuana? It's the gateway. That's what it is.
The IWW is a good gateway drug to
the
radical left.
Drug into socialism.
I like that. That should be their tagline, you know, like the IWW, the gateway.
Come join the gateway.
Yeah, exactly. Come through the gateway.
Come through the gateway. Yeah, that's even better.
In terms of like the question I have is on the trajectory of like the Socialist Party and where we first see the Communist Party. You have Debs, who's having some success, and one of the things I wanted to mention was I had recently reread The Jungle, which I hadn't read since like high school, and I'm pretty sure I didn't read the last like probably 80 or so pages of the book. And if you do read it, the main character, who, you know, is in the meatpacking and all that kind of stuff, ends up becoming a fairly radical socialist, and they are celebrating, I think it's the 1912 election, and how well they did and how many people they had gotten to like local office and all these kinds of things. And it ends on such a high-spirited note that it is, you know, it's in some ways it's almost like a trivia thing now. Like, did you know that, you know, Eugene Debs got 1 million votes in the election? But like, it's actually a pretty incredible thing to like that it happened, and that it actually isn't something that a lot of people know or recognize. But so with all of that, I mean, you have the success of Debs, and I mean, I don't think it's necessarily totally fair, and it's probably a bit too glossy to say that this Socialist Party of America was very much centered around Eugene Debs. And so when, you know, Eugene Debs eventually dies, what happens to the Socialist Party? What happens sort of then, you know, after the 1912 election, or what happens with the Socialist Party?
Well, even before Debs died, and even before his presidential election in 1920, after World War I, Norman Thomas was kind of an up-and-coming organizer in the SPA. And Norman Thomas was the one to move the Socialist Party further into the kind of mainstream in terms of politics, while simultaneously opening the Socialist Party's involvement in labor unionism. And this is also, so Norman Thomas begins to do this while also dealing with a breakup and a internal factionalism within his own party. And what I'm referring to is the emergence of the Communist Party in 1919. And so Norman Thomas leads the Socialist Party while taking into consideration the fact that he's dealing with groups who are splitting off of him based on things like, a lot of them were foreign-speaking contingents. A lot of them supported the Soviet Union and the new Communist International. They desired some sort of recognition out of that organization, and Norman Thomas and his associates were just not going to appeal to that. So the SPA had to navigate that path in the 1920s until in the 1930s, when the Popular Front opens up and there begins to be a little bit of new ground between the Socialist Party and then their former, kind of fragmented elements in the Communist Party. And again, Norman Thomas is still in charge of this, I believe, until like 1938 or 39. And in 1932, they gain over 800 something thousand votes in the presidential election. In 1936, I believe they get 400 or 500 something thousand, completely dwarfing the Communist Party throughout this period. But nevertheless, trying to remain active in pushing democratic socialism, which is not what other groups at the time who called themselves socialist but disassociated with the Communist Party were not trying to advocate. So that's why, again, my dissertation tries to go into this many worlds of American communism. There are so many ways to look at all these different groups, and we sometimes are guilty of what I call monolithism. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but when I talk about the communist movement in the United States, I use the term movement as opposed to party, because I don't want to have this tendency to ignore differences and overt divisions in order to try and categorize something as like one big totality. And so the Socialist Party has to deal with that throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. And as a result, by the end of World War II, they emerge into this kind of, I don't know the right word to say. It's like they are mainstream, but they're totally invisible. People do not really hear about the Socialist Party in the media anymore. People don't hear about the Socialist Party's candidates except in the local areas that they are living. The Socialist Party very much kind of falls into the background of the American political consciousness for a wide variety of reasons, far beyond the scope that I could weigh in specifically on. But World War II, the New Deal, the ability of the Communist Party to work with the Popular Front while the Socialist Party kind of was hesitant about it, a wide variety of reasons.
So, I mean, I think, yeah, what in some ways the sort of way that I do see it is when you have the sort of emergence of the Communist Party, and I think, I don't know, you correct me if I'm wrong on this sort of way, but the use of the sort of terms of socialism and communism, I tried to do a whole episode just on definitions to try to get out what I think they really sort of mean, but I also understand that they are used sort of differently than the way that I would kind of use them. So the one way that that's expressed is this division in terms of a socialist party, a communist party, which happens all over the world about, essentially at this time. And, it's the emergence of a sort of split in more legalistic, pursuing electoral politics, trying to gain political power through elections and through, a connection with the labor movement, but basically led by a kind of electoral-based political party. And then at the same time, you have an emergence of communist parties, sort of modeled off of, I think, in some ways, the Bolsheviks, who is I would say, more revolutionary, more radical in the sense that, pursue electoral politics as a way to build a movement for an eventual revolutionary takeover of power. And so I think that just in sort of the way to understand a communist party as compared to a socialist party, it can be difficult, and it obviously depends on different situations. But in general, socialist parties tend to want to pursue more electoral-based kinds of approaches to taking power, and communist parties have, at least traditionally, been more on the radical revolutionary front. Would that be a fair way to say that?
I think that's probably one of the easiest ways to describe it, but to get like the full scope of the truth, it becomes a little bit more complicated to use it in that kind of strictly bifurcated description.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, the CPUSA was fond of running presidential candidates as kind of a serious joke. In 1924, 1928, 1932, you read their behind the doors discussions about us. They had no, question that they were never going to make, the presidency. They understood from the offset that this was an entire, endeavor that was going to fail, and they spent, thousands of dollars on doing it. So there has to be a reason as to why they were doing it. Most of what the explanation is we were trying to get recruitment. We were trying to get people involved into this process. But then by 1936, you begin to see a little bit of a change. You begin to see the origin of this kind of lesser of the two evils theory. And that originates with a huge shift in the Communist International. And by the 1970s, 1980s, you had a Communist Party that was running for the president very seriously. When they had Gus Hall on the presidential candidate, they were not looking for recruitment. They were genuinely running for numbers. And then again, you see the resurgence of the lesser of the two evils thesis in 2008, 2012, and 2016. So I'd say that your description is accurate in a very broad general sense.
Right.
But if we get into the specifics of the politics of certain communist parties, it doesn't always so neatly fit that arrangement.
Right, and I think the experience of particularly the Communist Party of the United States of America, that is it has a very unique experience. I mean, the United States is unique in a lot of different ways, and the experience of definitely the Communist Party is certainly unique compared to European communist parties and things like that. There are definitely similarities, and I think as a general way, it's a very broad and not very deep description, but it is a way at least that helps make some sense of the words and that there is a difference sort of between them. But in terms of the American Communist Party, I mean, it was discussions I had in terms of the the question of why the Communist Party is takes the position it does, and it's a sort of, it has its own trajectory, its own history, and that's produced the positions it takes. And so I think that's just sort of helpful to keep in mind, because some people can be, and I've even been that way, to be honest with you, critical of particularly the CPUSA for positions that don't seem to be, fairly radical, I guess, for most people. And some perspective in terms of the experience of the Communist Party is important. That's part of the reason I wanted to have you on to talk about that sort of history.
That critical question leading up to was it right for the CPUSA to support Clinton in 2016? Yeah, that is probably the most frequent question that I hear.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And it's I think in some ways the cheapest shot that you can maybe the horses too. There's people who criticize was it Gus Hall that bought the horse ranch and stuff? And I guess
was it Gus Hall? I think maybe it was.
Well, it was somebody. Yeah, it was one of those guys who somebody had thought it was, I don't know, a misuse of funds or something. I thought that was a little cheap, but whatever. The sort of thing that I wonder is, you did mention the Communist Party, Communist League, and then so there's a sort of number of things that happen. Like if you started, say, the Depression, right? I would be curious to sort of hear the bit of history leading up to the Depression in terms of what was going on in the Communist Party in terms of, one, their sort of organization of particularly workers in the South, but also what was happening kind of in that political sphere in terms of any sort of splits and differences that develop, partly because of the international situation and then partly because of the Depression that ends up hitting.
Sure. So, so the groups that split off from Debs's Socialist Party actually formed two organizations. One of them was legal, like an actual public organization with an address. And then the other was essentially a kind of bunch of backdoor meetings in basements. Most of those, as I said before, who called for this split were foreign-speaking contingents of the Socialist Party, and also they did not desire a full split. But once it was clear by 1919 that they could not reform the Socialist Party, they began to just leave it and join this kind of public face called the Communist Party of America. From the start, the organization was hounded by federal agents concerned about the striking steel workers. I don't know if you're aware, but in 1919, one of the largest steel worker strikes broke out, and the federal government was very much concerned about quelling sentiments to prevent any sort of, grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor. Like, they didn't want that sort of stuff.
Right.
And so this pushed the organization underground. Underground in the sense that they called themselves the Workers' Party of America in public, and they kind of acted like a mirror of Debs's Socialist Party. But behind closed doors, they worked on alternative methods of organizing, and they began to take direction not only from the Bolshevik Party, but from the Communist International that was set up by Lenin in the early 1920s. Now, this organization, also known as the Comintern, had the purpose of trying to coordinate the efforts of communist parties all around the world annually at this conference that they held in Moscow. The organization came to be the very kind of defining element of American communism historiography, that is, its written history, but it's not the actual defining element of the history itself. So in 1927, the Workers' Party was ordered by this Comintern to break the veil of secrecy, to rename itself formally into a communist party, use that word in the name, and that's where they came up with the Communist Party of the United States of America, and then to run William Foster for president on that ticket in 1928. And in 1928, he got 48,500 something votes, maybe a little bit more than that. By the late 1920s, numerous individuals in the communist movement desired an end to this sort of Comintern oversight, specifically on the grounds that the organization had become kind of a mouthpiece for Stalin. So in 1928, the Comintern had this Congress called their Sixth International Congress, and they posted a bunch of resolutions. A lot of these resolutions were directives such as you cannot organize with socialist parties. You need to organize an alternative revolutionary communist organization, etc. Other things such as you need to accept national determination of the Black Belt. So African Americans have the right to secede from the nation if they want to. A whole list of resolutions that defined what became known as the, quote, third period. While nearly 1/4 of the CPUSA's membership could just refuse to accept this, a couple of the prominent individuals like James Cannon, J. Lovestone, they decided that rather than try to, amend or reform the CPUSA, because it was very clear that the leaders were just kind of falling in line with the Comintern, it was a big power shuffle that was kind of going on. They decided to just found alternative communist parties. So J. Lovestone founded the Communist Party, in parentheses, opposition. So kind of just to give the middle finger to the CPUSA. And then Cannon founded the Communist League of America, the CLA. So by 1930, we had 3 communist parties, all claiming to represent the workers of the United States. Foster's nomination for the presidency in 32 saw the highest polling numbers of any of these 3 parties, netting at just over 103,000 votes. But again, still paled in comparison to Norman Thomas and the Socialist Party, who I think got somewhere like 800-something thousand votes. But that's kind of the emergence and the origin of these factional splits in the movement. And they never really change much after that, at least not until you see the rise of civil rights and the Vietnam era in the 1960s. So we always had these kind of 3 fledgling communist parties throughout the Depression. Admittedly, the CLA referred to themselves as Trotskyists, and they called members of the CPUSA Stalinists. And so very quickly, once you start reading their works, you can see how that Trotsky-Stalin debate just became a huge, overinflated, unnecessary sort of debacle. And unfortunately, that's what plagued the communist movement up until 1935.
So yeah, I mean, I know that the CLA eventually sort of becomes the Socialist Workers Party.
Yeah, the SWP. I believe it was in 1934, 35, right around the time of the Popular Front.
And can you give a little bit of background as to what the Popular Front sort of period is, and where that sort of comes from, and what that meant in terms of that context?
Well, the best way to answer that would be to kind of explain how the Comintern fits into all of this, because they have a pretty big role into, even the presence of Communist Party members in the Popular Front. So from 1928 to 1934, as I said, the Comintern pushed this concept called the Third Period. Most people who probably have paid attention to high school history classes are at least generally familiar with the Popular Front as a kind of unified political and labor movement rallying behind the New Deal and the Roosevelt coalition. But the third period is a little bit harder to fully understand, and you can't understand the Communist Party and the Socialists in the Popular Front until you get their position in that period right before it. So, again, those resolutions from the Sixth Congress, the same ones that J. Lovestone and Cannon refused to accept, amounted to a basic program for the CPUSA in terms of political advocacy and labor organizing as a technique. So they wanted the communists to run an electoral campaign in contrast to dominant parties, and to organize revolutionary unions that were alternative to both company unions and the socialist-led unions and the American Federation of Labor. So the argument here being that socialist-led unions and the AFL are a bigger danger to workers' rights than the employers and the Republicans. Now, why do they argue this? Because at least you can trust the employers when they say they do not want unions. The communists feel you can't trust the socialists and the AFL to have workers' interests in their minds. But you can at least trust the employers when they say we don't want unions. So that's where this whole kind of the enemy of my enemy is still my bigger enemy kind of concept. So from 1928 to 34, you had the Comintern advocate this sort of staunch policy of division against the mainstream parties, division against the reformist or utopian socialists. And at the same time, this period also saw some of the most intense organizational drive of the movement's history. So this all changed in 35. Historians are fond of describing American communism as being 100% dependent upon the Comintern without looking at how the CP opposition and the CLA organized against it, and ultimately how the Communist International changed its little tune about the third period in 1935. So in 35, they held their 7th Congress. And the Soviet Comintern declared the previous year to be a, quote, year of great advances. Now, what do they mean by this? They pointed to the rise of communist parties all over Europe, the success of the CPUSA in the 1932 presidential campaign in terms of advancing communist politics. But most importantly, they were talking about the, quote, unquote, success of the 5-year plan that was in Russia. Boldly, however, the Comintern then ordered that, quote, all communist parties are hereby instructed to avoid schematic application of organizational forms onto their own societies. Communist parties should act independent and should not look to the Comintern for a rigid schema of revolution. That line is probably what I think should be read first when it comes to trying to understand communists in the Popular Front. Because right there, with a quick series of votes and the stroke of Stalin's pen, the USSR told the CPUSA to stop coming to them for all the answers. And this is, I can't think of something more important considering the subsequent events. So in 1935, the CPUSA pulls most of its independent sort of quasi-revolutionary unions from its bankroll and instead begins to fund and advocate a broad organizational effort that collaborates with the AFL, collaborates with the emerging CIO, worked with the political system of the United States, publicly advocated Roosevelt's New Deal. Of course, this netted lots of criticism and condemnation from the socialists and the Communist Party opposition. Those groups saw working with the Democrats as, quote, class collaboration. But it's a fundamental shift in the operations of the CPUSA that is sometimes overlooked. And although the CPUSA continued to accept its directives from the Comintern after 1935, they nevertheless acted pretty independently. And the unions that they supported, like the UCAPWA that I mentioned before, organized individuals such as Donald Henderson, Emma Tenuaka, Dorothy Ray Healy, and these individuals had no instructions by Moscow on how to organize people of Southern California and Southern Texas. They did it all based on what they thought was practical and effective for the situation. The lack of condemnation by the Comintern in 1936, I think, should be taken as a passive approval of the CPUSA's efforts, because if the Comintern can tell the CPUSA, do whatever you want, but if they do something the Comintern doesn't like,
they're going to let them know.
No, the Comintern would have something to say about it.
Right. Yeah.
So the fact that they don't say anything, the fact that they kind of just let the CPUSA continue with their activities, I think can be taken as passive approval of their efforts. And the CPUSA certainly saw it that way. That's why they didn't change their direction. And this continued up until the Soviet Union made their pact with Nazi Germany in 1939.
Well, then the question would be, what happens? Just stepping back there, you did mention that the as part of this Popular Front, you're talking about supporting the New Deal. What I have heard and the analysis that it was socialist and communist parties in terms of their organizing and labor sort of agitation during the period of the Depression that was a major sort of tool for the impetus to enact New Deal policies, up to the idea of either sort of implicit or explicit sort of it's the New Deal or revolution. Is this a sort of way too simplistic or non-nuanced way of explaining how the party was able to sort of put pressure on the sort of already economic dire straits that were happening, or was there something more sort of explicit in terms of potential like revolution in of the large number of workers who had endured 6 years of a depression?
It's a great question, and a question that I would certainly love to see more people do research on, to investigate more. I mean, as to the idea that the CPUSA was involved in the New Deal, I mean, I can tell you without a doubt that they were not at the negotiating table, and they were in no way, impacting the literal statutes and acts that are associated with Roosevelt's economic plan.
You're telling me that the National Labor Relations Board isn't a communist conspiracy?
Yeah, no. Unfortunately, it's not. I'm quite certain that it would be a much different organization.
Yeah, I'm definitely sure that.
But the question of whether or not Roosevelt supported the New Deal as a means for avoiding social revolution, that is a theoretical historical question that is probably being researched, but probably not being researched well enough. I know that Emanuel Wallerstein kind of tossed hint at that idea when he said that the world system reached a fundamental crossroads in 1929, where it had to accept the fact that it was always going to be prone to crises, and so it had to create a reformist welfare state in order to survive. Now, that's Wallerstein saying that that's capitalism as a whole responding to 1929, not like Roosevelt specifically, in that the New Deal is that response. So again, while that's certainly a plausible idea, I don't think that there's sufficient evidence, such as meeting with Roosevelt, letters exchanged, or something like that that clearly link communist activism to Roosevelt's decision for the New Deal. In many ways, I don't even really see why the CPUSA would do that, considering that they didn't even fully endorse Roosevelt until after the New Deal was already in place, like 1935-ish. Internally, the CPUSA had numerous meetings recorded about the nature of the New Deal, how to assess it. But from 1933 to 34, they were a staunch critic of Roosevelt and consistently criticized the limitations of the New Deal. For example, district organizer of Detroit, Carl Winter, he declared that the New Deal was, quote, insufficient to end ruling class control over the economy, and that unemployment insurance was an act that should be controlled by worker-nominated unemployment councils, not by the government. And in secret meetings available at the CPUSA's archive in New York, you can see how Earl Browder, the general secretary of the CPUSA at the time, and their presidential candidate, William Foster, desired to promote support for Roosevelt in 36 only as a means for displacing the, quote, Landon-backed Republicans, referring to the candidate Alf Landon, who was going against Roosevelt. And again, this is the origin of that lesser of two evils approach. And that's what I think that a lot of people today do not consider. They think that, the CPUSA has lost its edge, or the CPUSA is no longer radical anymore. They don't realize that this lesser of two evils approach actually was a theoretical development on the basis of the context of the Great Depression and the presidential election in 1936. So they had plenty of Marxist justification for making that decision. It's certainly not a, quote, abandonment of principles or something like that. Now, that was all internal. Externally, the CPUSA pushed for an expansion of the New Deal. So whereas inside their meetings, they would say the New Deal sucks because it doesn't do this and this and this and this. On their public face, in all of their newspapers, they would say, the New Deal is great, but it needs to be pushed beyond these limits. It needs to, go beyond what the reactionary Republicans are saying is a problem. It needs to go much farther than that. And so their presidential campaign of 36 was intended to reaffirm the desires of New Deal expansion while also focusing all the criticism on Landon. So they didn't really say anything positive or negative about Roosevelt, but they said the New Deal is a good thing to start with, but we need to expand it and prevent Landon from coming in and ruining it all. So that's the origin of that lesser of two evil thesis there.
Right. And the idea of running, even if you're running your own, it's to basically just shit on the other guy so that you make sure that you get what you're ultimately intending to do.
Yes. And it finally, the CPUSA nor the CLA, even after 36, they never shied away from calling the New Deal an attempt to, quote, reform capitalism as opposed to any real substantial change. They always left room to declare the New Deal as nothing but an attempt to quell the sentiments of the workers. I think that they were pretty keen on pointing that out, but they also recognized that it was a movement that was wholly endorsed and supported by the broad masses of the United States.
And it was undeniable at the time that it was doing something to at least ameliorate the terrible conditions of a laissez-faire reaction to a significant crises. It's you can have a very I don't know what you'd say, pompous view that, if I was in that, I wouldn't do. It's like, well, it's pretty understandable why you can easily say, yeah, this is not nearly going far enough, and we would want something much different. But to me, it's like how I feel about nationalized healthcare. Do I see nationalized healthcare as some kind of like silver bullet? No. But do I want it? Yeah. I think that it's pretty understandable and not problematic in any way to make a decision to support things that are ultimately good, and even as a way to say this is good, but we can do better. That's kind of an approach that is very understandable, and the idea that would somehow deserve criticism, I think, doesn't appreciate the importance of reforms on the way to revolution.
Or at least just trying to be grounded in your activism. Like, I think sometimes, a lot of these people today who look at communism and socialism, they talk about like the, quote, things that need to be done. And they talk about these very high-flying abstract ideals with very little connection between where they are right now and where they want to get to. And, then they look at that sort of action. They look at, the support of Roosevelt in 36, and they go, oh, well, they abandoned their ideals. They started class collaboration, etc. It's like, part of it, you need to bring your head out of the clouds. You need to stop trying to always look for the ideal that's out there. Because sometimes it's not out there. Sometimes the only practical solution is to work with what you have.
And speaking of not ideal conditions and working with what you have, what happens in 39? What causes the sort of what happens in 39 in terms of the Communist Party or communist movement's sort of response to the developments in the world?
Yeah, so 39, I write about this in my dissertation pretty heavily. 39 is what I call the beginning of the internal fragmentation of the political world of American communism. And it all came over the public support of the Nazi-Soviet pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The move transformed the communist mantra overnight from anti-fascism to pro-peace with fascist Germany. Then, once the Nazis invaded the USSR in Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 41, the CPUSA once again does just another flip-flop and immediately begins advocating war with Germany. So right there, we have the CPUSA sort of publicly discrediting itself. And in just that short period of time, they lost thousands upon thousands of members. And in both instances, they were doing the exact opposite of what the mass public of Americans wanted. When people heard about the Nazi invasion of Poland with the Soviet Union, people were convinced that we were going to be at war by the end of the year. And then you immediately have the Communist Party come out saying, like, no, everything's fine. Like, they deserve their right to invade Poland. Like, everything's okay. And then 1941 comes around, and this is before December 1941, mind you. It's summer of 1941. The Soviet Union gets invaded. They start calling for help, and the United States is like, well, we don't know what to tell you. Like, we're not going to just jump in and get involved. And the CPUSA quickly just does this huge turnaround saying Roosevelt's, trying to make peace with Hitler and blah, blah, blah. It's a huge misdirect. And, how they did not think about this at all is beyond my rationale.
This is
part of me thinks that they weren't thinking at all, that they were just kind of publishing whatever they could to get stuff out.
And this is where the discussion of like social fascism and things like that come out, right? This is when the accusations of social fascism are very dominant. And very quickly, almost anyone is up for suspect by the criticism of social fascism. The second that you do any sort of deviation from the line, it's not even like they consider your logic in the position. They don't want to hear your case when you argue against it. They just immediately assume you're just lost. You're lost in social fascism. And then in 1944, they miscalculated the impact of the Tehran Conference with Stalin about the post-war world. And the General Secretary, Browder, made a move to dissolve the entire CPUSA. And it was right then that all the factionalism that was so pent up inside the CPUSA just exploded. Why did he want to dissolve? What was the point of dissolving it?
Well, in his own words, Browder said, never mind. I won't use his words.
Right, fair enough.
Browder he looked at the Tehran Conference, and if you're not familiar with what the Tehran Conference is, it was one of the big three conferences at the end of the war, where the president, Stalin, and Churchill sat down to go over how the post-war world was going to work out. And the Tehran Conference was the one where Stalin kind of made gestures that we could find a cooperative peace situation in the world where, the communist world and the capitalist world would not have to be at war with one another. Well, Browder read this as like, I want to almost compare it to the way that Trump supporters read Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un. Like, he shakes his hand and he says that they have a great meeting, and everyone's just like, oh, it's done. The Korean War's over. Like, everything's taken care of. That is what Browder did. Browder saw the Tehran Conference and was like, everything's fixed. Like we don't even need a communist party in this country anymore. We have achieved sustainable capitalism. We have achieved the means for creating a socialist future without revolution. And so he pushed to dissolve the CPUSA on that basis.
Interesting.
And he faced tremendous amounts of criticism.
I can imagine.
At first, not even from his own people. At first, everyone in the CPUSA kind of followed behind the line. The Comintern got dissolved around the same time. So Browder probably also saw his move as similar to Stalin dissolving the Comintern. But that did not stop the French Communist Party leader, Jacques Duclos, from issuing a staunch criticism saying Browder has no idea what the world is going to be like after World War II. And this move is nothing but just evidence that the Americans are completely lost when it comes to communist theory. Many of the passionate organizers at the time, such as Emma Tenuaka, just simply left the movement. They just walked away, just cut all ties, walked away. Others, such as Donald Henderson, who led the UCAPWA union in California, left their active work but remained ideologically committed. They kept going on speaking tours, kept promoting socialism, but they just were not active in any more organizational work. And then still even more others, such as Beatrice Lumpkin, who's still currently the oldest living member, turned to alternatives. She turned to the Progressive Party, the nomination of Henry Wallace for president in 1948, and many districts of the CPUSA actually went and endorsed Henry Wallace for president. So for nearly 3 decades, this was all argued to be kind of the end of the American communist movement. But I see it as less as an ending and a little bit more of a diffusion. And here's where I certainly differ with a lot of the more mainstream scholars of American communism. I feel that anti-communism made it nearly impossible for civil rights groups to utilize communist organizers, regardless of how effective they were at recruitment. Ben Davis, who was an organizer and a lawyer for the Communist Party, Hosea Hudson, who was an organizer in Alabama, both of them remarked at how numerous civil rights organizers after World War II simply did not want to be associated with a group or an ideology that was having its leaders hauled off to court for attempting to overthrow the government. I mean, you cannot advocate an end to Jim Crow and advocate communism, because then immediately your advocacy of ending Jim Crow becomes tantamount to overthrowing the government. And so they don't want to get involved in that. Those civil rights organizers had a big enough hill to climb, and bringing the communists along with them was like adding the weight of a dump truck on their backs. They're like, it's just, we can't do this. We have to cut the dead weight. And so that's where you see this diffusion of communist activism. And they spread out into the wide variety of political action groups, local clubs, book clubs, even the Progressive Party. Many of them get involved with the Progressive Party. So it's this huge diffusion that kind of dissipates out. But while that diffusion occurred, the ideology and the organizing tactics did not go away. They simply started to change names and associations. Peaceful protesting and sit-ins by 1960 were completely alienated from any sort of ideological inclination, although many state and civil rights or civil groups tried to certainly display it as such. They tried to say this is communism, but that message never succeeded at resonating with people. And if you look all the way back to that Pullman railcar strike that solidified William Foster's ideology and Eugene Debs's ideology, or you look to the response of the CPUSA at the death of an organizer in New York in 1931, peaceful protests and sitting in on the lawns of town halls were a staple, if not canonical, political approach of communists long before 1960 ever came around. Civil rights organizers in the late 40s and 50s succeeded at dismembering this history from those actions as a means to then gain traction and end Jim Crow, which I would certainly say is a good thing. I'm not trying to make it sound like it was bad that they dismembered this history. I think it was a necessary action that had to happen. But it is nevertheless important to acknowledge that peaceful protesting, sit-ins, die-ins, that sort of stuff did not originate in the 1950s and 60s. A lot of it gets diffused and borrowed and learned from other movements, particularly socialists and communists.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that you said part of the reason for this diffusion is this the anti-communism that develops after the end of the war. And so although there was obviously a miscalculation in terms of the necessity for a communist party in a peaceful coexistent world between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that sort of didn't come to pass, and you have the beginning of the Cold War, which has the sort of anti-communist both rhetoric and genuine sort of campaign to limit the influence of the Communist Party. And so I guess what I'm sort of curious about is sort of sketch out for us the sort of the zeitgeist, I guess, at the time, as you have, there was this need for diffusion because you have this giant thing, this second sort of Red Scare that defines part of the political experience of the late 40s and through the 50s in terms of what would develop into the COINTEL program, J. Edgar Hoover's sort of notorious conspiracy theory type of concern about the communist takeover. I mean, if anyone wants a good laugh, read J. Edgar Hoover's book about how the communists are going to take over America. It's a laughable read. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And so where did he get this shit? I don't know. But so kind of sketch that out so that we can sort of better understand the need for the diffusion and the sort of.
So yeah, I mean,
what happened.
I think probably the best source to understand this diffusion would be to read Beatrice Lumpkin's autobiography. It's called Joy in the Struggle. And she talks about how at the end of the war, the high-flying big political debates that were internal to the CPUSA, which also poured out onto their publications like the Daily Worker and whatnot, she had access to all these, but she kind of let them just fly by her. What was more important to her was, first of all, they had secured some real gains through the New Deal as far as the National Labor Relations Act, collective bargaining rights, etc., and health or Social Security. She believed that these things were genuinely good things for American people, regardless of whether or not her party advocated for them. And then by 1948, when Roosevelt's former vice president, Henry Wallace, goes up for the presidency under the Progressive Party, she sees that as the moment at which, it's no longer necessary for her to vote her party line. It's no longer a duty to sort of follow the directives of her local Communist Party. That perhaps the ideals promoted in the early 30s and mid 30s had become ideals of the progressives by the 1940s. Now, whether or not that's true, we could go off onto a debate about that for hours. But to Beatrice Lumpkin, that was the reality. And so when it gets to be the point where you have Communist Party leaders hauled off for the Smith Act trials and, members of all the major unions purging their members who are not signing loyalty affidavits, to her, the natural result of this is to continue your activism, but simply downplay the political identity. Still go to your bargaining committee, which she was the shop bargaining committee agent for a few different groups throughout the late 40s. But you still go there, you still sit down, negotiate at the bargaining table. You just don't bring your identity with you. You go and you perform this as just an American worker, and you leave that identity in private. Now, certainly, Lumpkin is kind of like an isolated case. Not all communists were like her. There were many who, like Ben Davis, who were like, I am never dropping my Communist Party. But that's a good example to see how people can rationalize this diffusion is not so much like this is our solution, but like this is what we could do to continue the efforts that we've been doing for the past 15 years.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. Do you think that the I mean, the role of the sort of second Red Scare, the McCarthyism and things like that, how do you sort of see that in terms of its role in pushing people to kind of see dropping the label as a way to maintain the important sort of struggles and things that you're dealing with, but not have to, in some ways, carry baggage that may be a hindrance to actually doing that kind of work? Like, is it just, in some ways, do you think this realization in people was a natural growth of just the way the winds were blowing, or is it a result of or a reaction to this rising sort of anti-communism?
For people like Lumpkin who were not involved in the political decision making of the CPUSA, but were rather like the kind of boots on the ground members, I think it's kind of a belief of an evolution of this kind of activism. For other members, it's different. For John Gates, for example, an organizer who is a college-educated guy, ends up going off to fight in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades in World War II against fascist Spain. And then when 1950 comes along, he sees all of his leaders get hauled off to jail, and he suddenly gets thrown the burden of leading his district because all the district organizers get hauled off. And he does not do what Lumpkin says. He kind of pushes towards let's pull back. Let's not get so heavily involved in weighing our opinion on domestic policy, foreign policy, etc. Let's go back to our more bread and butter issues, which is working in the unions, which again, for this time was also unrealistic because a lot of the unions were making their members sign affidavits that said that you were not a member of the Communist Party. And then that's the third group of people, the people who were kind of either overtly saying, yes, I'm a communist and I refuse to sign that document, or the ones who buckled and in the midst of bargaining negotiations said, fuck it, I'm going to just drop the whole communist thing and just stick with the labor union.
Gotcha. In terms of I've heard all kinds of sort of statistics about the role of the FBI in terms of numbers of informants. There's a whole counterintelligence program that's put in place. There's that are now available manuals, counterintelligence manuals that show things like how to disrupt a meeting and how to, kind of handicapped organizations from focusing on the things they were focusing on by actually sort of even causing schisms and sort of fighting in order to like solidify the group and things like that. So what kind of, how much of an infiltration, I guess, or something did the FBI do in terms of, if it's nothing else, kind of spying on or keeping tabs on these sort of communist organizations, specifically the Communist Party, and how deep a thing are we talking about?
Well, that's a great question, especially for right now, because scholarship is unearthing so many new records out of the FBI that were not available previously. There is a great book. I actually have it right here on my desk. It's by Jennifer Luff called Common Sense Anti-Communism. And her whole book is about how anti-communism is much older, and the FBI's involvement in anti-communism is much older than the 1950s and the late 40s. That their involvement is as early as the AFL saying the Socialist Party is a problem because, they are creating, radical contingents in the labor movement to pit themselves against our craft unions. And I think it's just so interesting to read through these new perspectives on it. I think, like, as far as like the earliest point, like I said earlier, the Bureau of Investigation, I think, let's see if I can find its actual name. It was just called the Bureau of Investigation. It's the precursor to the FBI. And this one was done by the Department of Labor under the Attorney General Harry Daugherty. And their interest in communists was centered on the already existing interest in unions, like I said about the AFL. So they were concerned about socialist presence in AFL unions and in the kind of newly emerging non-craft-based unions. And William Foster led an organization called the Trade Union Unity League, which was kind of a quasi attempt at organizing all unions under one umbrella. And he tipped off the Bureau of Investigation to open up looking at their groups by advocating themselves as alternative to AFL locals in Chicago. At the time, deportation was the instrument of choice for most of these matters. The bill that introduced the Bureau of Investigation literally said, and I'm quoting right out of there, "It does not matter if the undesirable alien has an American wife and 10 American children, or whether he has lived in America for 40 years." End quote. So to pitch the program annually to the Department of Labor, the Department of Justice just argued this is the best way to avoid the snail pace of the courts. And in a matter of years, the Bureau of Investigation is able to pull off all these subversive activities that today we would most certainly consider unconstitutional.
Right.
But by the 1940s, this program evolved into a tremendously sophisticated anti-communist witch hunt. And this is the Red Scare that we're more commonly familiar with. We sometimes just don't think of it as a very systematic and methodological attempt to break down communist activity. We usually think of it as a political thing, like, we made the mistake of denying free speech to communists. No, it was very much more than denying free speech. It was an attempt to remove this ideology from society. And the Cold War transformed all of these, quote, radical alternatives to the AFL into, quote, sympathizers of a foreign government intent on overthrowing the republic. So, you can see how their investment in this investigative process just amplified by the time we get to the 1950s. And we're talking about a program that had adapted to the results of the Smith Act trials in defense of free speech in 1957. Much of COINTEL's actions, even though they were later deemed illegal for violating the First, the Fourth, and the Fifth Amendments, I think those are the ones that they were charged with.
Yep.
Much of these actions that were deemed illegal were still illegal at the time, had anybody challenged them. But it's just you were in a context where there was no need to challenge it. I mean, you already had the Communist Party arguing their free speech in the courts. And so COINTEL's actions, which were totally unknown to most people in government, it's just not going to get talked about. No one's going to call it out until it's too late. In fact, I believe that the only way that they found out about some of these activities was from an illegal break-in on the FBI's headquarters.
Yeah.
So to date, the program remains probably the most stark attempt by the federal government to continue a link between communists and civil rights leaders. So they did try very hard to press a connection between Communist Party organization, or at least Communist Party theory, with the advocacy of civil rights. But even though most of these organizations had disassociated with the CPUSA, the FBI continued to push it. And I in part think that's where they failed. They pushed something that was no longer palatable to the average person. I'm sure people would disagree with me on that, but that's my 2 cents.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, obviously, one of the sort of two targets um, for that the COINTEL program actually went on or went against was the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King particularly. There's the famous anonymous letter sent to Martin Luther King with some fairly damning things, saying that he ought to kill himself and things like that. And so, and I definitely, I think in J. Edgar Hoover's mind, it was definitely the case. But I think you won't hear it not so much anymore, but the connection between communism and Martin Luther King. That there are a number of people very close to the Martin Luther King in terms of the movement, and so Martin Luther King is a secret communist. What would you have to say in terms of the role of either sort of communists or communist ideas in terms of the civil rights movement as maybe represented in one way by Martin Luther King, and then not necessarily the civil rights movement, but something different in terms of the Black Power movement as represented by the Black Panthers, who were themselves also a significant victim, I guess, of the COINTELPRO program.
Yeah, so the Martin Luther, I mean, the strict question, is Martin Luther King a communist?
Yeah.
I would say no.
Right.
I would say that he's probably better described as a democratic socialist. For example, he was not fond of ending private property, and he was certainly not fond of the notion that religion was the opiate of the masses. Much like other prominent democratic socialists, including Eugene Debs, by the way. Martin Luther King saw the utility of social institutions such as the church, regardless of its downsides, as a possible route to engaging with people. He understood the power of faith and did not disregard it as some kind of primitive inclination of the toiling masses. And I think I don't agree that faith is a requirement for understanding socialism, and I don't think that religion necessarily has a role in a socialist society. But I do nevertheless understand, like him, there is a utility in these social institutions. People put a lot of stock in these institutions, and you can't just go up to them and be like, all of your stock in that is false. Like, you're never going to convince people. Like, you have to try and find another way around it. And here's the pill I think that'll be very hard for some people to swallow. Like, I don't think people want to acknowledge that Martin Luther King would probably completely disagree with that statement from Morpheus in the film The Matrix, where he goes, quote, "Some of these people are not yet ready to be unplugged." I think King would respond to that statement with, well, then you're using the wrong plug, or you're using the wrong outlet.
Yeah.
So, that's the big fundamental difference there between King and then the other major factor in the 1960s civil rights movement or person, which was Malcolm X.
Sure.
And Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and the entire movement of Black Marxism is probably more close to the communist style movement of that era than what you saw out of, even SNCC or SDS, those organizations, etc. Much of the work of the Black Panthers and Black Marxism as a whole was influenced by a combined grouping of writings by Marx, the collected works of Frederick Douglass, and then Lady Stokely Carmichael. This all coincided, however, with a more global event, something that people don't do too often. They tend to focus a little bit too much on the national thing. You need to sometimes pull out and look at the broader events going on. And this is the rise of decolonialism and resistance movements against Western imperialism. This more global affair combined within it two sub-movements, a Pan-African movement and a national liberation movement. The Pan-African movement was more prone to Marxist ideology and funding from the Soviet Union, endemic by the tremendous amount of support that Moscow threw at many Pan-African movements from 1956 to 1969. The National Liberation Movement, in contrast, sought to create independent republics in the colonies of these formerly dispossessed people. So Black Marxism came about under this context, and it utilizes the argument that was so popular during the third period. You cannot fight capitalism unless people of color are united into a single force. And, that resurfacing of the theory of national self-determination, the resurfacing of the idea that African Americans had the right to secede and create their own country if they wanted to, that was the core of the sort of communist movement of the 1960s. Now, I feel like I'm having the tendency to make the mistake that Angela Davis says not to make, which is don't associate Black Marxism with the communist movement of the 1960s. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I am trying to say that they are probably the most visually emblematic organization of Black Marxism and the ideals of the communist movement at that time. By 1969, when we actually get Angela Davis, show up and become a predominant figure in the movement, she then becomes the voice to bring in new theoretical understandings that were totally void from the movement prior to 1969. And this includes thinking about the subdivision of Black women against Black men within their entire race as a kind of umbrella underneath the subjugation of people of color, and the desire to see white chauvinism as not so much a, what do you want to call it? Not so much a political label, but a sort of passive tendency that is seen by people resistant to social change. So it's those things that I think are important to think about when we talk about the Black Panthers,
right?
Especially the works in contrast to Martin Luther King, because we started this off kind of going, is Martin Luther King a communist? Well, he can't be a communist if we can see other examples of very kind of militant communist efforts being played out in American history.
Yeah, exactly. I guess in some ways it's interesting to contrast it in some ways between maybe a certain, Black Marxism and a kind of white Marxism in that it's a very crude way of doing it, but the sort of role of communist or communism or communist ideas in terms of the anti-Vietnam movement, the war in Vietnam. It's this time where you do have I like Chomsky becomes somebody that, there is a certain subsect of I'd say a significant subsect of the anti-war movement that is in some ways motivated by, Marxist ideas. And then it is the time when you have the emergence of sort of postmodernism as a way of, and sort of neo-Marxism, and those kinds of ideas are developing. And in some ways you had mentioned it too, but in some ways, a certain tendency of that is, I think, in some ways emblemized by the Weather Underground and the SDS, and then in terms of like the actual Weather Underground. And so, what role did the communists sort of play in the anti-war movement? And then, what do you give us a little background on the Weather Underground?
So for that, I would refer to my research because we're now getting into the period of American communist history where there really is not that much written. Very, very little written on the CPUSA at this time. Very little attempts to connect movements like the Weather Underground to some sort of communist message or movement. So for this, I referred to the individuals that I've interviewed. And over all this interview, I'd say that their roles in the anti-war movement was threefold. So one man I interviewed staged a tremendous, and I'm not going to give out names just because for anonymity.
Yep.
But one man that I interviewed staged a tremendous resistance effort to the draft by waiting in line at the draft office until he entered the building. And then he grabbed a standing American flag on one of those like metal poles and used the end of it as a spear to puncture the glass of the building. And then he told everyone to run out, and everyone just kind of fanned out of the building. He was, of course, arrested. Numerous people were arrested. But his story is one major his story is the kind of scene that involves physically resisting the efforts to get young men involved in Vietnam. That was probably the biggest thing mentioned by all individuals I interviewed who lived through Vietnam, which is that they were concerned about young men going off to fight in a war that they didn't even really fully understand. That was their number one issue. Other communists held public events to try and burn their draft notices as a means for peaceful protest. But the point with this group was to draw attention into the idea or the opinion that young men did not deserve to be drafted and thrown off to a foreign country just because they had the physical capacity to fight. Next, you had these sort of kind of drop out of the mainstream communists who followed individuals like Abbie Hoffman. Are you familiar with him?
Abbie Hoffman, no.
Have you seen Forrest Gump?
Yeah.
So you know the scene in Forrest Gump when he's at the Washington Memorial and he's invited after Vietnam to come up and give a speech, and then like somebody pulls all the plugs on him and nobody can hear what he's saying?
Yep.
Well, the guy who was like yelling at the crowd, going like "Viet fucking Nam,"
right?
That was Abbie Hoffman.
Okay.
So Abbie Hoffman is this kind of really esoteric sort of like epitome of what we might think of as a hippie today. Abbie Hoffman most certainly did not support communism as an ideology. If you tried to bring up communism around him, he would probably tell you that you have a problem, that you need to get your mind out of that prison of isms. Like you need to stop following ideology.
Gotcha.
But nevertheless, there were communists who dropped out of the mainstream and started to follow him. And these individuals started to find a deeper understanding of morality by being physically present in sit-ins and die-ins, as was the case at the Pentagon in 1968 and in Chicago, the Democratic National Convention in 1968, where numerous activists of the so-called Yippie movement were arrested for simply sitting in and kind of creating havoc against the Democrats. So that was the second group of communists. Then finally, you had the political communists who were still highly active in the CPUSA, advocating a very unrealistic platform for the minds of 1960s Americans. A complete withdrawal from Vietnam, full acceptance of the right of Vietnam to be a communist nation, and an end to the funding of West Germany. Now, why the CPUSA like bundled all of these things together into one platform, I will never understand. It seems like it was a continuous like trip ups, like just one trip up after the other with the CPUSA's leaders. Like they could have just done a complete withdrawal from Vietnam, ended at that. They probably would have gotten a lot of support from it.
Yeah.
But they combined it with this. You also have to accept them of their right to be communist, and you also have to stop funding West Germany. Like it's so unrealistic. I don't know why they're, even running these kinds of platforms.
Yeah.
And so most of those that I interviewed, fell into these three categories, but they also did not talk about their role in the anti-war movement as specifically communist. And here's what I think was most important about that. Like many others before them, they would describe themselves as like, communists taking part in an anti-war movement, as opposed to the anti-war movement becoming communist because of their presence. Additionally, much unlike the Third Period and the Popular Front, communists in the CPUSA and socialists in the Socialist Party did not require any sort of instruction, directive, order, or act by their parent organization to get involved with the anti-war movement. When the individuals that I spoke of, like the man who chucked the American flag through the glass window at the draft office, he did that on his own accord. He was not ordered by the Soviet Union, by the CPUSA, by his district local club. That was him acting on his own. And, when I interviewed him on that, he wanted to make it very clear, look, you need to understand that that action was me as a human being. That wasn't necessarily me as a communist. But that doesn't change the fact that I still identify as a communist. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a different way of...
Go ahead. What were you going to say?
It was just a different way of participating in those kinds of, it's a way of, I don't know, there's a certain strategy in terms of doing that, because you're still able to achieve goals that you want to genuinely achieve, but you may not have to, in some, I don't know, I guess carry the baggage, but yeah.
Yeah. Now the Weather Underground, is kind of I wouldn't necessarily call it the outlier during this period, but I certainly disagree with anyone who tries to depict the Weather Underground as like a legitimate communist organization in this country. I've seen people make comparisons to the Knights of Labor and about how the Knights were fond of setting things on fire, and how they were fond of damaging property, stuff like that. But the Weather Underground is I mean, they did not just damage property and make threats. They were a quasi-terrorist organization. They kind of sought to undermine capitalist society by creating havoc. And kind of just short of Charles Manson, they're a gleaming example of the desire by many radicals in the 1960s and early 1970s to try and sort of instigate a crisis whereby revolution would then be necessary. Like it's no turning back after that point. In the most literal sense, I would describe them as kind of 1960s Leninists. But what they lacked and what Lenin had at the time was popular support. What they failed to realize is that within the context of Vietnam, their efforts failed to demonstrate how their position was any better than that alternative to the U.S. government. And here's the one example that I have for it. I believe they got started in 1969, I think, and then they start their activities in late 1970, early 1971. Well, if the people of the United States were outraged in 1968 by the My Lai massacre in Vietnam and the government's or the military's actions in that incident where children and innocents are slaughtered, why would they be supportive of bombing innocent people in the Pentagon in 1972? So the Weather Underground, just like their method of protesting the war was just fundamentally flawed. It was not at the right time, and it just could not gain traction by the means that they had set up. And while I get that some people support them in an abstract sense, that they are kind of a Leninist group, that they are, quote, doing the necessary seizings against the leaders or the elites, whatever, but the ruling or the Weather Underground should be seen as an example of what not to do when you don't take a minute to try and assess the palate of your base. They should have taken a message or a lesson from the My Lai massacre and people's response to it. That is not the kind of activities people want to be seeing. They do not want to see the death of innocents.
Right, and it really hammers home the importance of having the right tactics at the right time, that are representative of the actual conditions that you find yourself in. And, the Weather Underground is adopting tactics that may be effective given a certain set of conditions, but they were not the conditions of the early 70s in the United States. It just wasn't. It is a tactic, and I commend what efforts they did take when to try to not do it when it would kill a lot of people, but at the same time, it just is not a tactic that is in any way calculated to get success, given what is happening. And so it's just, like you said, a serious miscalculation of where things are at and what would be effective at getting us closer to where we want to be. And an insurrectionist kind of movement in the U.S. in the early 70s obviously wasn't the kind of movement that was going to generate the kind of conditions that would make it ripe for some kind of significant change. It just... Yeah,
they probably looked to like Algeria, and they probably saw the Algerian Revolution, and those radicals and militants used very much the same tactics. They bombed innocent cafes, town halls, all that sort of stuff as a means for bringing the nation to such a desperate need for change.
Mm-hmm.
But that's Algeria. That's the third world. You know, I think that, you know, it's maybe part of the problem with the Weather Underground is they didn't have the understanding of like first, second, third world nations that we now have today, in which the physical, socioeconomic conditions dictate the limits of your actions.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate the internationalism in terms of you know, not ignoring the work that other people are doing, but you know, the idea that you can adopt the tactics of other people in significantly different situations is just in some ways it's a very non-Marxist perspective. You know, I mean, the whole idea is understanding the conditions of the time and what that will produce in terms of the way people think and how they relate to each other and to the general society and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, practical change. You know, I will point out I'm running slightly out of time here just because it's getting close to 10.
I know.
Would you like me to answer one more question?
Yeah, like that's exactly what I was thinking too. Like it's about up till almost 3 hours. But I seriously, before I ask it, like I'm seriously appreciative of you, you know, coming on and like, I mean, I have learned things from you in the course of the talk, definitely. And you know, one thing that, you know, at least come back and we'll talk more about the Civil War and that kind of stuff, because I think that would be super interesting to do. But if you want to come back, I would want to have you back because it's super awesome.
I would love to. I'd love to come back.
Awesome.
And, you know, to say, first, let me say again, it's an honor that you invited me to take part of this. And if I were to say that there is a takeaway from all this, you know, the message that I would want to see people learn, the mistakes not to repeat, etc. You know, people should learn that communism is a lot more American than they realize. That's kind of what I tried to drive home really early on, is that a lot of this stuff, you know, is heavily influenced by events that go on here in the United States. And I'm not making an argument for American exceptionalism. I'm pointing to the facts. You know, Marx's writings on the American Civil War, the origin of socialist labor theory with the German 1848ers, the Haymarket Affair and the rise of the May Days, the rise of the Knights of Labor, the socialist parties, all of these help to build the movement of the pan-socialist left as we know and understand it today, which includes groups like communists, democratic socialists, and even some contingents of the Democratic Party. Communism is not some, you know, Russian political regime, nor is it a foreign conspiracy. Most of this movement was built right here in America. You know, what we did wrong was spend too much time trying to decide who had a better path to socialism. Is it the Debsian style socialism? Is it De Leonism? Is it Fosterism? Is it Browderism? We spent too much time even worrying about that. When we, you know, what I would love to see is, you know, like to hold a big annual Congress, an actual Congress of American Socialists or Congress of Americans dedicated to the end of capitalism, whatever you want to call it. Something where you can get the CPUSA, the SLP, the Socialist Party, the Democratic Socialists of America, hell, even those crazy people at the RCP, all of them. I just would really love it if all these groups could sit down, negotiate some kind of means of working together in unionism. I know that it's unrealistic, but hey, you know, the CPUSA, SPA, CLA, CP opposition, and SLP were able to sit down and negotiate sometimes during the third period. If that's the case, I'm pretty confident these days we can find a way to swallow our pride, start a Congress, and try to get some real discussions going on.
I could not agree with you more. That is something that I have been really thinking about and coming up and like really trying to understand and what could be possible to do that. I love the idea of calling it the United Socialist Alliance, and so that we can take back USA. But you know, at the same time, a national congress of all of the different socialist groups as a way to understand our differences, put them aside for a second to organize ourselves in a way that we could genuinely fight and come together is exactly what we need. I agree with you 100%. and we gotta find a way to make it happen. I agree that it seems like a serious uphill battle, but like you said, all those kind of things have happened in the past, and they have to happen in the future. So
continued discussion about it, continued advocacy about it. It can happen.
Absolutely.
We need more people like you doing this stuff. More people need to be like me and also go out and write and research in this stuff.
Yep.
We need to get the word out there and the call out there.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you. And I really appreciate you, coming on. You're a wealth of knowledge and the first guest I'm going to have on the podcast. So it's an inaugural thing. I really, really appreciate it. I mean, it's been 3 hours, but it's 3 super, worthwhile hours, and you took your time out to come. So let's do it again. Let's figure out how we can get that Congress started. And before you leave, though, how can people, do you have like a Twitter or something that you post stuff? Where can you find like what you've written, or where can we?
I do have a blog.
All right.
It's called The Red Historian at .blogspot.
All right, so The Red Historian at Blogspot. I'll put a link to that in the description for the episode, and that way hopefully people can find you. And thanks again, man. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, man. I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
All right, you too.
All right, take it easy, Kevin.
All right. If you found this episode interesting, please check out The Sensible Socialist at sensiblesocialist.com. There you'll find a blog as well as all of the rest of the episodes. And if you like the podcast, please consider supporting it. You can find me at Patreon, and you can support it that way. If you'd like to be on the podcast, if you think that you have a particular perspective that you think would be important to hear, please reach out to me at sensiblesocialistpodcast@gmail.com. And I would be happy to talk to you about the issues that you find important. So I really want everyone to participate. So whether or not that's just sort of passively by helping support the podcast or actively by participating as a guest, I absolutely encourage you to do that. sensiblesocialistpodcast@gmail.com, or check it out, sensiblesocialist.com.